steel, firearms, and the Industrialists crossing into another world. Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in this saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 726: Wang Jun's Reform. Led by Claude, the Arda instructors, under the generous treatment of King Rodney's VA, were extremely enthusiastic about their work. They immersed themselves in the military camps, living and eating with the officers and soldiers recruited by the king for nearly half a year, diligently summarizing and analyzing the various problems currently facing the kingdom's army, and finding suitable solutions. The instructors quickly realized that their experience in the Northwest Bay could not be completely copied here. It must be admitted that Paul Gleman's approach to his army was definitely a lean army strategy for that era. It included rigorous organization, thorough training, ample supplies, and extensive education. The last point was particularly important. After passing the initial startup phase, Paul's educational requirements for the soldiers went beyond simply ensuring they weren't illiterate. He increased investment in the army's education. In addition to continuing to strengthen reading and writing, soldiers were also required to learn subjects such as mathematics, something that seemed unbelievable to outsiders. Especially for highly specialized branches of the military, such as artillery, surveying, meteorology, and engineering, as well as many civilian positions, the knowledge they need to master is quite advanced in the eyes of ordinary people, something only wealthy and leisurely scholars would study. Paul even had his officers and soldiers read poetry and watch plays to cultivate their character. Many people were puzzled as to why the Marquis would invest so much in a group of expendables who could lose their lives at any moment on the battlefield. This was indeed difficult to understand, even for Paul himself. He only vaguely knew, based on his stereotypical understanding from his previous life, that enriching the soldiers' minds, improving their culture, and broadening their horizons would definitely promote combat effectiveness. But as for how exactly this would be promoted, all Paul could think of was faster learning of new things and more swift execution of orders. Was there an overinvestment? Perhaps investing 50% would have about the same effect on improving the army's combat effectiveness as investing 100%? Whatever, they had won several wars anyway, so let's continue like this for now. Perhaps Paul was unaware of a deeper, more obsessive-compulsive tendency within him. He desired perfection in everything he loved and considered important, striving for perfection in every aspect. People are multifaceted, and individual soldiers may vary in quality, but under unified discipline and a shared cultural education, the army as a whole should possess noble character, selfless spirit, and loyal hearts. The army is not merely guardians, but also artists, explorers, and role models for the nation. When they retire and return to civilian life, they can use their acquired knowledge to benefit society. Absolute perfection is impossible, but that doesn't prevent him from striving for it. He can't accomplish everything at once, but even small improvements are welcome. As for the possibility of fostering a group of revolutionaries, Paul felt that internal conflicts under his command hadn't yet escalated to the point of no return. If that day ever came, it would be their own fault. Fear shouldn't prevent them from doing the right thing. Furthermore, if that day ever comes, whether it's last-minute scrambling or stubbornly sticking to a path, it will be worse than proactively making changes now. One can imagine the vast difference between the current Arda army and other armies of the time, thanks to Paul's tireless cultivation. However, this is also due to the long-term peaceful environment of the Northwest Bay, at least before the elimination of the Kent family and the Orc invasion. This allowed Paul the leisurely pace of cultivation, and crucially, the Arda army, while a standing army, had never been large, and its burden was manageable. But things are different on Crystal Radiance's side. What kind of army does King Rodney's VIE need? Most importantly, it must be as capable as the Arda army, but even more crucial is the ability to quickly form an army, to form a large-scale army, and to quickly replenish and recover to a level that doesn't hinder combat after suffering significant losses. Clearly, simply replicating the Northwest Bay system wouldn't be enough for the king's treasury, even with the aid of military scrip. The instructors had to make significant cuts to their existing systems, referencing the prototypes Paul Gleman had handcrafted in the lab, to design mass-producible models that were easier to manufacture and more versatile. For example, the educational requirements for soldiers were greatly reduced, requiring only basic literacy, with some knowledge only needed to be mastered by elites with specific professional needs. However, certain essential elements remained. They divided the king's army, just as they had done in the Northwest Bay, into first-tier troops, second-tier troops, and reserve troops. First-tier troops received training intensity on par with the Arda army, second-tier troops had their training intensity reduced depending on the situation, and reserve troops did not leave their posts. The equipment and supplies for each tier of troops also differed. The royal domains were also divided into conscription zones, and through the king's decree, officials of the royal domains were required to conduct population censuses within their jurisdictions, establishing files for people of all ages, especially men. It sounds simple, but for the current royal government, it was a massive undertaking that could not be accomplished overnight. But it was worthwhile. If the army could be replenished in time when it suffered heavy losses, the phenomenon of a single battle determining the outcome of an entire war would no longer occur. In the daily training process, the Arda instructors compiled their experience into a guiding booklet, recording the precautions infantry needed to take during daily training. Initially a thin booklet, its contents were gradually refined as the king's army matured. Furthermore, due to increasingly close ties with the Northwest Gulf, many new equipment, including gunpowder weapons, appeared in the king's army, leading to the addition of more and more new content. Eventually, it became a thick book encompassing everything from formations and training to combat and daily conduct, the infantry regulations. While Rodney's VIE's army was a step backward in terms of its development compared to Paul Gleman's, or a lower-budget version of the Arda army, its methods were more suitable for rapidly building a powerful army in a vast and populous country. Later historians generally regard it as the beginning of the large-scale modernization of human armed forces. The infantry regulations, along with the subsequent military discipline regulations, military service law, War Mobilization Act, and Wartime Economic Control Act, together outlined the basic structure of a massive war machine. This highly efficient war machine inspired many countries to emulate it, using Waldo's infantry regulations and other related documents as blueprints, making slight modifications to establish their own new armed forces. This system repeatedly demonstrated its high versatility, regardless of the level of the imitators compared to the Austrian army. They were all utterly crushed when facing their own traditional armies. Chapter 727 Social Experiment. Hansel Abbott sat somewhat reservedly in the palace dining room, giving a slight nod to the waiter who was setting his food. His gaze fell on the tableware, exquisitely crafted and flawless, but all ordinary porcelain. Porcelain, a flagship product that brought Alder enormous profits, had long been popular worldwide via merchant ships from the Northwest Bay, its smooth, beautifully patterned pieces beloved by all social classes. However, thanks to Alder's status as the country of origin, porcelain prices weren't as exorbitant as in other countries. After the initial frenzy surrounding porcelain's emergence subsided, prices had fallen to a somewhat high level. It couldn't compare to vessels made of gold or silver. But Hansel had heard from his father that the tableware used to entertain guests at the palace was made of gold and silver. "This is not disrespectful to you, Sir Abbot," King Rodney's VIE explained, noticing Hansel's gaze lingering briefly on the tableware. "I've already sold most of the gold and silver artifacts in the palace." "Oh, Your Majesty, you've truly made a great sacrifice for the country," Hansel flattered, but inwardly felt a pang of regret. It truly hurt. He felt a pang of regret for the king. Many artifacts in the Crystal Palace had been passed down for centuries, their value far exceeding their physical worth, even a plate, even a set of cutlery. Rodney's VIE said resolutely, "As long as it strengthens the Alder army, any sacrifice is worthwhile." He then picked up his wineglass. "Hansel," the king called him affectionately, "I'd like to toast you." Hansel was immediately flattered and quickly picked up his glass, clinking it against the king's before drinking. Good heavens, this was unimaginable before. A son of a less than honorable noble family was being privately entertained in the magnificent dining room of the palace by the supreme ruler of Alder. What an honor. "You've done an excellent job." "Excellent?" The king's words cooled Hansel's feverish mind. "Back then, your uncle assigned you to various lords loyal to the royal family to strengthen ties with them. Of all those people, only you, Hansel Abbott, truly brought immense benefits to the kingdom." Hansel's heart tightened. Rodney's Vizai's words still made it seem as if he were still his direct subordinate. But Hansel understood that he could no longer escape Arden's system. In the Northwest Bay, he was a high-ranking official in the Council of State, entrusted with important responsibilities. As the person in charge of agriculture, he played a crucial role in the land reform initiated by Marcus Gleman. He earned both fear and respect from many landowners and gentry who controlled vast tracts of land. The feeling of being enveloped in that aura of power was something he had never experienced before, when he was merely a lowly tax collector in Crystal Radiance. Hansel realized that he and other noble sons who had been dispatched to various places to contact the king's loyalists were merely sent away by the royal family under a pretext to avoid wasting food. The most obvious evidence was that the royal family had never shown any intention of recalling them over the years. Back then, after coordinating with Earl Paul Gleman to contribute large quantities of essential food and military supplies to Jingayo, Hansel had eagerly awaited the royal family's call-up. However, after year of waiting, his heart grew cold, and he gradually came to regard the Northwest Bay as his base. Moreover, Marcus Paul Gleman treated him well, providing generous salaries and consulting him on various matters, making him feel valued, while the royal family had never given him a penny in all these years. For all these reasons, Hansel finally completed a shift in his self-perception, preferring to be a big fish in a small pond rather than a small fish in a large pond. Besides, given the rising momentum of the Northwest Bay, it was truly difficult to say which was the big pond and which was the small pond. Hansel felt no remorse towards the royal family. He had done everything he was supposed to do and was worthy of his baronial title. How? The king seemed to notice the fleeting embarrassment on his face and smiled, saying, "That's just a sincere compliment. Nothing more." Rodney's VIE disdained being a riddle-teller who probed people's hearts. "I hope he will continue to work diligently for Paul. After all, he is my brother-in-law and a Marquess of the kingdom. As for me, I only hope he will continue to maintain a bond of loyalty and goodwill between Gleman and Rodney, and I will not make any excessive demands on you, thank you." "Your Majesty." Hansel looked at him. "So, Your Majesty, is inviting me to the palace for dinner an unreasonable request?" "Ha ha ha." Rodney's VIE laughed for a while. "I just wanted to talk to you about my brother-in-law. You've been by his side for so many years, you must know him better than Catherine and I do." Hansel asked, "Isn't Princess Irene the same?" When he learned that the arrogant former head of education was actually the kingdom's second princess, Hansel was uneasy for a while, because he had debated with her several times in the Council of State meetings. However, as he completed the transformation of his self-identity, he put this worry behind him. Rodney's VIE raised an eyebrow. "She's still a young girl, inexperienced in the ways of the world. She might exaggerate some things and overlook others when it comes to another young, capable, and high-ranking man." Hansel thought, was it not an unreasonable request to comment on his de facto ruler? The king smiled again and said, "Whatever you say, I will listen carefully. You know, I've even entrusted the army to Paul now. It's a huge gamble, and I'm eager to understand him from multiple perspectives." Since it was the king's request, he couldn't remain silent, but did he mean he could say whatever he wanted? Hansel considered for a moment and said, "Your Majesty, entrusting the army to Marcus Gleman's men for training is a correct decision. Marcus Gleman is an ambitious man." Rodney's VIE was confused by his contradictory statement. "Please don't worry," Hansel continued. "The Marquis's ambition doesn't lie in the pursuit of worldly power." The king asked doubtfully, "You mean he's an explorer of the spiritual world?" "But I don't think Paul is very enthusiastic about religion." Hansel shook his head. "Not religion. Besides studying some strange and unusual technologies, the Marquis is also passionate about sociology. He seems to want to find a way to construct another social form based on the many virtues of humanity, diligence, altruism, and self-control, etc. That's what I mean by ambition." "Oh? That seems no different from what the wise men of history pursued." The king nodded. "Yes, but historically, wise men have relied on enlightened monarchs, powerful heroes, or omnipotent gods, while Paul Gleman seeks to rely on mortals themselves." Go on. "The Marquis conducted several social experiments. He built several large farms, but didn't appoint managers, letting the people there decide what to do. The farm members worked together according to their different roles and collectively decided on various operational matters. Crucially, the farm's property and harvest belonged collectively to the farm members. It's rather complicated in detail, but that's the general idea." "Naive," the king commented. Yes, naive. We all think so in private, Hansel agreed. And without exception, those farms all went out of business for various reasons, but the Marquis of Gleman is obsessed with it. He seems to believe that there is an inherent, beautiful quality in human nature that can regulate behavior, allowing ordinary people to spontaneously form a positive and beneficial order even without a coercive force. It's just child's play. The king immediately laughed. Please don't relay my assessment to Paul, it's too impolite. Of course, Hansel nodded. But he said that some mistakes must be repeated to understand why they were wrong. It sounds like someone has done that, perhaps, Hansel said. But I don't think someone like the Marquis of Gleman would be keen to become that kind of coercive force. The king smiled. What if he also opposes others becoming one? The Marquis of Gleman is also a realist, Hansel replied. Theory is theory, reality is reality. He hopes to achieve a balance between the two. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 728 The Holy Mule Empire. Arda's escalating support for the royal family wasn't solely motivated by retaliation against Giles. As Hansel Abbott returned north by land, a fleet sailed north from West Harbor, carrying various horses bred by the older royal family. The royal family maintains several large stables across its directly controlled territories, their horses providing a steady supply of horses to support its military forces. The Northwest Bay was now directly threatened by the Orcish armies, whose agility and mobility had impressed Paul during the last invasion. Although Arda's army, with its superior discipline and weaponry, had managed to hold off the invaders outside the Northwest Bay, it remained largely on the defensive. Orcish cavalry continued to roam freely across the northern alderlands beyond the Northwest Bay, while Arda's army, lacking long-range projectile capabilities, could only watch helplessly as this atrocity unfolded before their eyes. Thus, the construction of a powerful horse administration and a formidable cavalry became a priority. King Rodney's VIE strongly approved of the Northwest Bay plan. When Hansel conveyed Paul's wishes to him, the king pondered for a moment and then assigned a special envoy to accompany Hansel to the royal stables to select horses. Initially, Rodney's VIE was somewhat worried, not so much about the growing Northwest Bay threatening his position, but because he himself was building a new army and needed a large number of horses. However, the quantity Hansel mentioned dispelled the king's doubts. The first batch of horses to be purchased from the Northwest Bay consisted of only around 1,000, a negligible amount for the royal family. He even worried about Paul. This number of cavalry is no match for the orcs. Your Majesty, the Marquis knows you are building an army and that horses are in short supply, which is why he hasn't asked for more. The key point is that the Marquis wants this batch of horses for breeding purposes, not for the cavalry to ride. Breeding. When Rodney's VIE heard this, he became interested. I've heard of it. You mean, like how farmers cultivate crops? Yes, Hansel nodded. However, there is a Father Anderson in the Northwest Bay who has made some significant discoveries about the genetics of organisms. Compared to the previous kind of haphazard and reckless so-called breeding, he has discovered some patterns. As long as these patterns are followed, you can cultivate the plants or animals you want. Hansel introduced the king to Father Anderson's famous pea experiments and the laws of segregation and independent assortment derived from them. The pea experiment was quite famous in the Northwest Bay. At Paul's request, the experiment's content and conclusions were quickly incorporated into the newly introduced biology textbooks in various schools. Hansel was also quite familiar with it, as the agricultural sector under his jurisdiction had already begun cultivating high-yield crops with Anderson's help. If plants could do it, animals certainly could too. Rodney's VIE recalled receiving a letter from Paul a long time ago, the contents of which seemed to be similar. Paul had strongly hoped that he, as king, could issue an edict prohibiting inbreeding. However, he was too busy at the time and left the matter of prohibiting inbreeding to his ministers. You mean, various beneficial, so-called, traits, can be hybridized to allow that genetic factor to be fused into the next generation? The king was very surprised. Yes, Your Majesty, your understanding is spot on. Just imagine, what a perfect horse it would be if it possessed all the virtues of being tall, strong, obedient, and hard-working, and could endure hunger without being picky about food. Even the Lord of Light hasn't created such a thing. Hansel painted a rosy picture for the king. With such horses, the kingdom's warriors could ride them, and those mere orcs would be nothing more than a bunch of scarecrows to be trampled on. The king slammed his fist on the table excitedly. Tell Father Anderson to do his job well. If he succeeds, I will grant him a title. And so, a large number of horses were sent to the newly opened horse farm in the Northwest Bay. Previously, the Northwest Bay didn't have any large-scale horse farms. The stables of nobles and knights were all filled with horses purchased from elsewhere at great expense. With the flourishing of both agriculture and commerce, the demand for livestock in the Northwest Bay skyrocketed. Merchants were no longer just trading by boat. The increasingly popular new agricultural machinery also required large numbers of cattle and horses. As a result, large quantities of livestock were purchased into the Northwest Bay every year, and many shrewd individuals made their fortunes in this business. However, most of the horses purchased by the people were riding horses, draft horses, or camels for carrying goods. True war horses were extremely rare, existing only on a small scale in the armed forces of local lords. Therefore, the Arda Council established a dedicated Ministry of Livestock to manage livestock resources and formulated a long-term development plan. The first phase of this plan was personally named the Holy Mule Empire by Paul. One of the main objectives of the Holy Mule Empire plan was to build large-scale horse farms to breed various types of horses, including military horses, on a large scale to meet the growing demand for livestock in the Northwest Bay and to provide support for building a large-scale cavalry force. In addition to quantity, quality also needed to be improved, the key being breed improvement guided by Anderson's laws of genetics. However, improving horse breeds is a long-term process, requiring considerable time, and Paul, eager to unleash a crushing attack on the orcs, was impatient. Then, a stroke of luck occurred. The Holy Mule Empire project, requiring public participation, was open to the public. Soon after, a spellcaster from Horn Bay met Paul through Laodicea. He was one of the mages who had come to the Northwest Bay with Sylvia Shidini for refuge. Under his magical abilities, Paul witnessed the entire process of a blade of grass from sprouting to withering, within 6 hours. Simply put, this mage could accelerate the growth of living beings, or rather, shorten their lifespan. Lord Griles, I must be honest, casting spells on animals is much more difficult than on plants, and the larger the animal, the harder it is, especially a large one like a horse. The success rate is also a problem. I'm only confident about grass right now. However, if you support my research, I'm quite certain I can improve it. The mage was honest, proactively explaining some of the difficulties. I will support your research. Paul was overjoyed. He finally felt that his risk in taking in these spellcaster refugees had been worthwhile. Chapter 729. Of course, involving mages in specific breeding work faced some difficulties. For example, Anderson, who was in charge of breeding, happened to be a clergyman. Due to well-known reasons, the relationship between the two groups was quite tense, and if they were to come into contact because of work, there was no guarantee that it wouldn't cause some trouble. It was best to keep them out of contact through procedures. Paul instructed the newly established Ministry of Magic to solve this problem. This was a small, secret department, at least for now. Mages and magic were objective realities, and as Paul gained a deeper understanding, he felt that the actual size of this group was not small, so it was necessary to set up a dedicated agency to handle related matters. Originally, he intended to have his most trusted mage, Laodicea, in charge of this agency, but the mage firmly refused. He had no choice but to have Cecil select the most discreet person from the intelligence department to be in charge, and to select people from the group of mages who had come to seek refuge to serve as subordinates. The head of the Ministry of Magic would be subject to mental testing by Laodicea, regularly or randomly. Hansel recounted his experiences in the capital, Crystal Radiance, to Paul, including being invited to a banquet by King Rodney XVIII, the king's inquiry about his opinion of Paul, and Hansel's reply to the king. He looked at Paul cautiously, as if trying to gauge whether the Lord would be displeased with his response to the king. When he saw the other man merely smile and shrug, Hansel breathed a sigh of relief. His Majesty will be sending some young officers to the Northwest Bay. He hopes you will command them as you would your own soldiers, stationing them on the front lines against the orcs, to gain experience at the grassroots level. We can arrange positions for them. Princess Catherine will be accompanying them to the Northwest Bay. Paul nodded. It seemed Arda was about to welcome a mistress. There have been recent personnel changes in the kingdom's government, Is there anything particularly noteworthy? The Chancellor of Finance has promoted a fellow named Trevor Stewart to one of his deputies. Paul noticed a disrespect in Hansel's tone, a look of doubt appearing in his eyes. Hansel explained, the Stewart family has always had a prestigious reputation in Crystal Glory's financial circles. In this era, so-called finance was essentially lending. A hint of disgust flashed across Hansel's face. Although many people are in this line of work, the Stewart family is particularly unscrupulous. But there's no way around it. The kingdom's government needs such a purse strings. Paul understood that this prestigious reputation was clearly meant negatively. Trevor spoke with me privately. He's very interested in our Northwest Bank and bond issuance. Oh, and your insights on the nature of money. According to him, he used to have some vague, unsystematic concepts lingering in his mind, but after hearing your profound insights from others, it felt like the sky had suddenly cleared. He regrets not being there to discuss it with you in person. However, he feels your current approach is still too conservative. If you are willing to cooperate with the Stewart family, he is willing to provide us with more financial support and more creative ideas. Paul shrugged. It's best to keep our distance from such people. He didn't intend to respond to Mr. Trevor's invitation. In the Horn Bay, Nussburg was in its most critical moment. As the largest city in the region, Nussburg's ability to attract population was remarkable. Besides the city center protected by its high walls, there were also large areas of buildings outside the walls. Before the arrival of the papacy, Nussburg hastily erected a temporary wall to protect its outer perimeter, but it was quickly breached by the vigorous papacy forces, and all the buildings outside the walls fell into enemy hands. The papacy had made ample preparations for capturing this large city. Massive catapults were arrayed around Nussburg. Soldiers loaded huge stones into trebuchets, turned winches to pull the long arms back to almost horizontal, and then suddenly released them, causing the trebuchets to rise rapidly and launch the stones with terrifying whistling sounds as they rained down on Nussburg like meteors. As a long-range weapon, the catapult was poorly aimed, almost never hitting its intended target, but when there were many of them, and the entire city was targeted, they were terrifying. Almost no civilian buildings within the city could withstand the barrage of massive stones. Countless houses were destroyed, and the suffering of those struck by the boulders was horrific. Besides the stone throwing, the actual attacks on the city never ceased. Whenever the stone throwing offensive paused, the papacy soldiers would push siege towers and ladders, launching attacks under the cover of arrow towers, each assault more ferocious than the last. With the fall of major ports on land, the Horn Bay Alliance's navy was severely weakened by the loss of land-based reinforcements, suffering repeated defeats at the hands of the papacy fleet. The once proud navy was forced to retreat a portion of its forces to its last remaining port, Nussburg, allowing its crew to go ashore and assist in the city's defense. The remaining forces dispersed, becoming small-scale pirate gangs, desperately harassing passing papacy ships at sea. These small-scale raids could not stop the papacy's growing naval power, partly supported by the papacy, and partly by recruited defectors. The papacy fleet surrounded the port, only temporarily unable to break through due to the thick iron chains blocking its entrance. Nussburg's communication with the outside world, both on land and at sea, was completely severed. Those inside didn't know the fate of their allies elsewhere. Perhaps they were still fighting, or perhaps they had already fallen to the enemy. The entire Protestant Union was reduced to just this corner of Nussburg. An apocalyptic atmosphere hung over the city, and the people inside held on only out of fear of the church's punishment if the city fell. The Church of the Horn Bay, which had made various threats to intimidate the Protestant Union at the start of the war, had now become the spiritual pillar of the people of Nussburg. All able-bodied men were mobilized, guarding the city walls day and night against the church's assault, while the stronger women were assigned to various logistical tasks. The old, weak, and disabled gathered in the churches, praying day and night for the Lord of Light to deliver salvation and punish the corrupt elements outside the city who had usurped the Father's name and committed tyranny. Perhaps because of their devout prayers, a miracle truly occurred. Chapter 730 Camp Rower. After the failed first attack on Lyons Port by the Allied forces of Giles, King Garrett III of Collins did not give up on this lucrative prize. While General Cook, the papal commander, was busy directing the offensive against Nussburg, Garrett III lobbied various factions within the Papal Guard who also coveted the wealth of Lyons Port. They gradually formed a small group, plotting how to capture the small port of Ordos. One morning, as usual, General Cook conducted his routine pre-siege inspection and unexpectedly discovered a large number of troops not deployed in their designated areas. The old general was furious. Upon investigation, he found that several city-states, led by Collins, were missing. He had to suppress his anger and not lash out on the spot, only ordering a halt to the attack. After all, Collins was the second largest force in the Papal Guard after the Papal Expeditionary Force. Just as he was about to send someone to inquire, a subordinate hurriedly reported that he had witnessed a Collins army heading towards Lionsport. The whip fell from Cook's hand to the ground. A shot. Cook instantly recalled Garrett II's strange behavior at yesterday's meeting. He had seemed rather distracted and perfunctory during the discussion of the new attack plan. Damn it. I should have been more careful, Cook lamented. A bunch of bastards who only know how to cause me trouble. Quick. Send the fastest horses to stop those idiots. Following his order, several messengers galloped towards Lion Harbor, raising long plumes of dust. As they approached, they first heard a rumbling sound, then witnessed a startling sight. The walls of the Aldo were not high, which was why the Collins army hadn't brought heavy siege equipment. They had only carried lightweight ladders. However, that low wall became a formidable barrier. Unfamiliar firearms were deployed upon it, spitting fire at any intruders who dared approach, accompanied by muffled thunderous roars. Each blast of that weapon felt like an invisible slap to the besieging troops, sending them crashing down in droves. Some died instantly, others lay on the ground groaning in agony, a truly gruesome sight. The terrified messengers rushed back to report the situation. As for the Corinthians, unless they were foolish, they shouldn't continue their relentless assault on the small city shrouded in demonic power. Cook waited furiously in his tent until Garrett II and his comrades returned with the slinking remnant of their forces. On the eve of victory, after all, even the most powerful enemy, the Horned Bay Alliance, was reduced to a single, crumbling city. A fierce conflict erupted among the high command of the Holy See. You dared to disobey unified command and provoke the Ordos, wasting a golden opportunity to attack Niceburg. If you weren't the king of Corinth, your head would already be on the flagpole, Cook roared, rebuking Garrett III. According to etiquette, this was actually inappropriate. After all, no matter how small Collins was, Garrett III was still the king of this city-state, wearing a crown. But Cook couldn't care less. To hell with your unified command, Garrett III retorted, swinging his thick arms. If your command is so brilliant, why haven't we held a victory parade in the streets of Nijmsburg yet? In any case, you shouldn't have provoked the Ordos. I'm short of money. I'll say it again, I'm short of money. I'm short of lots and lots of money. The money promised by the papacy is late, so I have to find a way myself. Cook looked incredulously at a king who was originally of noble bearing, shouting like a thug. Your Majesty the King of Collins, for money, you have lost your honor and your faith. Actually, I've wanted to say this for a long time. You've plundered so much wealth along the way, making the papacy lose face for you. Aren't you satisfied yet? He turned to moral condemnation of Garrett III. What? Does eating breakfast mean one doesn't need lunch or dinner? The king roared, raising his arm. To hell with honor, to hell with faith. General Cook, please come back to reality. What do you think we're fighting for? For faith? Let me tell you, it's for money. And how do you think we turned the tide and won? Let me tell you, it's because I distributed all the wealth in the treasury to everyone who could go to the battlefield. That's what motivated them to fight hard. That's what gave us the advantage on the battlefield and allowed us to push all the way here. It was money, not you, the great General Cook, that brought us victory. General Cook was enraged. He looked at the frenzied King Collins. This was blasphemous. He was implicitly denying that the victory of the Holy See was a divine intervention, attempting to explain it with vulgar money. His patience finally snapped, and he drew his sword. What do you want? King Collins was startled and drew his own sword to meet him. This immediately caused chaos, with soldiers on both sides drawing their swords, and a bloody battle seemed imminent. At this critical moment, the local Horned Bay Church stepped forward, using their persuasive skills to calm both sides down. Gentlemen, the Horned Bay Church representative announced, I have just received good news. Our northern army has won another victory and will soon be approaching Eton, that evil wizarding kingdom. Final victory is imminent. The current difficulties are merely the darkness before dawn. After the Horned Bay Church representative delivered an inspiring sermon in the name of the Father, everyone pledged to overcome the current difficulties and achieve final victory. They believed that once victory was achieved, all problems would be solved. However, it seemed that divine protection had ended. The siege of Nisburg by the church's protectors appeared to be the peak of their great holy war, after which they helplessly declined. The conflict among the high command was temporarily resolved, and as night fell, the entire camp fell silent as the soldiers slept, conserving their energy for the next day's battle. Just past midnight, in the darkest hour of the night, a small commotion arose somewhere in the camp. It might have been a brawl between several drunken officers, or perhaps a soldier who had risen in the night had accidentally knocked over a brazier. Normally, such minor incidents would have been quickly resolved by the patrolling soldiers. But the protracted siege of Nizhny Novgorod had created a climate of anxiety throughout the papacy, especially among the lower-ranking soldiers. During the siege, they were expected to charge into battle at the cost of their lives, only to face severe punishment upon retreat. The terrible casualties and physical and mental exhaustion weighed heavily on their spirits. The recent conflict among the higher-ups had fueled rumors and unrest. And even the embellished accounts of the terrible weapons the Collins had encountered at Lionsport were being spread. This small disturbance at night wasn't immediately suppressed, instead, it spread throughout the camp as if triggering a chemical reaction. The papacy had rioted. Chapter 731 Camp Roar 2. The desperate screams, the indiscriminate slaughter, the soldiers like demons possessed, the apostolic nation was plunged into a massive catastrophe. Those who witnessed this large-scale riot were not only members of the apostolic nation. The reconnaissance platoon of the 3rd Company, 1st Battalion, Arda Marine Corps, was ordered to approach the apostolic nation's camp under cover of darkness to gather intelligence for a planned retaliatory operation. The soldiers concealed themselves in the bushes, silently watching the scene they had never witnessed before. Within the Arda army, from officers to soldiers, the concept of a riot was known. Instructors emphasized it when teaching soldiers military basics, explaining its psychological causes. This was vastly different from other armies that treated it as a taboo subject, something to be avoided and explained by reasons like demonic possession. But when they witnessed it firsthand, they were still shocked by its horror. The squad leader later wrote in his reconnaissance report, "Everyone went mad, falling into an indescribable state of frenzy. Perhaps some remained conscious at first, but were immediately swallowed up by this indescribable, enormous swamp." Soldiers, wielding any weapon they could get their hands on, charged at their comrades who had fought side by side during the day, screaming horribly, either killing or being killed. The bloody fighting continued until 4 in the morning. The chaos caused a fire in the camp, which ironically saved those who survived. Although they were frenzied, their instinct for fire caused them to scatter and hide. Only then did their sanity return slightly. Another important reason was that everyone was exhausted. The Allied forces inside Nisburg did not take the opportunity to attack. They should have been able to observe the chaos within the Apostolic Guard camp from the city walls. Perhaps they thought it was a trap, or perhaps they were terrified by the sight of the Apostolic Guard killing each other. The Marine scouts withdrew before sunrise. The horrific clamor finally subsided. The fires ignited in the chaos had reduced the pacifist camp to ashes, leaving behind a trail of charred, unrecognizable corpses, many of whom had likely fallen to their comrades before the flames reached them. King Garrett III of Collins, a survivor, with the support of the equally surviving church messenger, Ku, became the temporary leader. General Cook, the former commander of the pacifist forces, was unfortunately found dead near his quarters by the stables. He had likely attempted to escape the chaos on horseback and was surrounded by the mutinous soldiers. His body was covered in horrific knife wounds, but easily identifiable because they hadn't been affected by the fire. Surrounding him lay the bodies of his guards and even more mutinous soldiers. Cook had been dispatched by the papacy to Hornby to assist the local church in winning the sectarian war, but he died just before victory was within reach, and victory slipped away. There was no time to mourn the general. The papacy had to retreat before the Allied forces in Nisburg could react. Having already suffered heavy losses the previous night, continuing the offensive was unrealistic, and even if some strength remained, it would require rest and replenishment. Thus, under the command of Gadler III, the papacy hastily collected the corpses, packed their belongings, and retreated in silence to a stronghold in the direction they had come from. Only upon arrival did they have time to count their numbers. The result was horrific. When they reached the walls of Nisburg, they numbered a full 30,000. After several days of siege, they still had slightly over 26,000 by yesterday. However, After this terrible mutiny, the current count showed less than 10,000. A rough report after collecting the corpses before the retreat indicated that nearly 10,000 bodies had been buried, leaving nearly 6,000 missing and unaccounted for. The total losses far exceeded the casualties incurred during the siege itself. The southern papacy, the main force of the offensive in this war, suffered devastating losses. King Collins and the church emissaries summoned everyone, and after a brief discussion, they quickly settled the matter. The evil and corrupt blasphemous alliance had cast a terrible spell on the apostolic army, causing them to kill each other under the influence of forbidden power. Meanwhile, the greedy and unscrupulous merchants in nearby Lion Harbor had also provided assistance to the blasphemous alliance. In Laketown, Paul received the emissaries of the Horn Bay Church and the castle. They delivered a letter in strong terms from Archbishop Elvis of Horn Bay, condemning the Horn Bay merchants of Lion Harbor for maintaining large-scale trade with the blasphemous alliance during the war. The constant influx of weapons and supplies had caused enormous trouble for the apostolic army's military operations, seriously violating the various prohibitions issued by the Horn Bay Church. As the instigator of this war, the Horn Bay Church naturally believed that all entities within its dioceses should be under its prohibitions, even those it did not actually militarily occupy. Paul scoffed at this. The apostolic army had also purchased a considerable amount from Lion Harbor. He smiled at the church messenger and said, "Sir, first of all, I must state my position. I have always supported the sacred and great cause of the church. If these merchants were on my territory, I would not hesitate to throw them in jail. I mean, provided they have violated local laws," he added the condition to prevent the other party from taking advantage. "But unfortunately, they are in Horn Bay, and I cannot control what they do. Even if they commit crimes, it is not in Alda, which is beyond my jurisdiction. And Lion Harbor is a city that these merchants have independently developed and built overseas. The land was purchased from the Horn Bay Alliance. I am the Lord of Alder. How could I possibly extend my authority there? To avoid various troubles, Lion Harbor has always been officially described as an autonomous city established by a group of merchants, although many people know the truth. In that case, does this mean that the church can punish these greedy merchants who have committed crimes on foreign land on your behalf?" The church messenger was not as angry as Paul had expected. He simply gave a silent, cold laugh and posed the question. "Does this include the use of force?" "Of course." Paul paused briefly, then said, "I advise you to consider other, more moderate methods. As far as I know, production in Horn Bay has been severely damaged by the war, and Lion Harbor's role is irreplaceable. For the great cause of God, any sacrifice is worthwhile." The messenger seemed to think he had Paul under control, his eyebrows raised, his expression smug. "Then I can only express my regret," Paul helplessly shrugged. The messenger from the Horn Bay Church left the Northwest Bay unhappily. But he was unaware that a new order from Lake Harttown was sent south almost simultaneously, instructing Lion Harbor to eliminate the surrounding military threats in the name of a volunteer force. Chapter 732 Formal Intervention. Often, events unfold unexpectedly, from the fate of an individual to the grand sweep of history. Just as Niceburg was plunged into its deepest despair, its inhabitants resigned themselves to either annihilation or enslavement. Then, as if the prayers of the people in the church had finally been heard by the Lord of Light, he descended from the heavens and slapped the enemy who was about to bring them destruction into the slumber. Scouts sent outside the city confirmed the retreat of the Holy See's army, and finding no traps nearby, the city erupted in uncontrollable jubilation. Residents who had previously huddled trembling in their homes poured out, filling the streets and alleys, embracing and kissing, singing and dancing. The lower classes rejoiced, but the upper classes, after a brief period of elation, had to confront the harsh reality. While the enemy had temporarily retreated, Niceburg, like a chronically ill patient, lacked the strength to pursue their victory. This triumph had an element of luck. Now their armed forces were barely able to protect the city, let alone fight far from it. The enemy beneath the city walls had retreated, but the surrounding area remained under the control of the church's army. The Horn Bay Alliance had only gained a brief respite when the noose was tightening. How could they seize this opportunity? The council learned that the papacy's army was reorganizing, and with the powerful backing of the papacy, they would soon regain their former strength and launch a counterattack. The Horn Bay Church and the papacy that followed were too vast. One or two setbacks were not enough to break their determination to eradicate heresy. Sometimes, failing to seize a glimmer of hope is more painful than utter despair. At this moment, a messenger arrived from Lion Harbor. The messenger congratulated the Horn Bay Alliance on escaping the crisis of annihilation, but his next proposal caused an uproar throughout the council. Civilian groups in Lion Harbor were willing to raise a military force to assist the Horn Bay Alliance against the church. It was like a windfall. Because of the siege, the people of Newsburg were unaware of the recent events involving the papacy's army in Lion Harbor. The Newsburg authorities tacitly refrained from inquiring about the Marquis Paul Gleman himself, instead forging an alliance with the so-called civilian groups of Lionport. While the church's army withdrew, their navy remained stationed outside Newsburg's harbor, their primary task being to lift the blockade and restore the Horned Alliance's sea lanes to the outside world. The day after the alliance was reached, the Horned Alliance Navy, which had been hiding in the harbor, launched an attack on the church's fleet. Given that the Alliance Navy was far from its peak, the church's naval commander initially questioned the opponent's suicidal act, but then readily accepted what he considered a reckless challenge. The land-based fools had suffered a setback, so the Navy would regain its prestige. The commander was ready to add a glorious chapter to his military career. Both the Horned Alliance and the church's navies were still equipped with galleys, employing age-old tactics, ballista firing, ramming, grappling hooks, and finally, boarding maneuvers. Just as the two sides were locked in a fierce and evenly matched battle, the Arda Navy attacked from upwind. Despite the fierce fighting among the sailors below, the high command of both fleets managed to observe Alda's fleet. Neither the Horn Bay Alliance Navy nor the Church Navy had experience engaging Alda's navy. While sailing ships were familiar to the Horn Bay people, the fleet's disciplined formation was still impressive, especially the colossal ship in the middle, resembling a castle, which inspired awe. Alda's fleet sailed towards the battlefield in a single file. The Church Navy commander sensed something amiss. He instinctively felt the newcomers were hostile and immediately ordered some ships to prepare for a counterattack. The sudden arrival of the fleet and the abrupt orders caused some confusion within the Church Navy. The Alliance Navy, knowing the Ordas were there to aid them, was able to continue fighting without distraction, and their morale was high because Lion Harbor had kept its promise to come to their aid. The cannons on Alda's warships had a range and accuracy far exceeding those of the Church warships' ballistae, allowing them to easily launch preemptive attacks from areas the enemy couldn't reach. They opened fire, and instantly, massive plumes of smoke billowed from the Arda fleet, flashes of flame flickering within. With deafening roars, high-speed shells slammed into the hulls of the Church ships, projectiles and flying splinters mercilessly claiming the lives of sailors. The Arda fleet was serious. The Church fleet was thrown into further chaos, forced to scramble more ships to deal with the new enemy. Although galleys were more maneuverable in smaller bodies of water, the Arda fleet had a well-established strategy for dealing with them. First, they used their superior range to inflict heavy casualties on the galley crews. The simple sails of galleys, used only for auxiliary propulsion, were ineffective for normal navigation, leaving them helpless. The Arda Navy performed at its usual training level. Under the command of its flagship, the Sea Fortress, the ships moved forward in an orderly fashion, each firing in rotation, salvo, or in batches under unified commands. The roar of cannons blended into a soaring death symphony, deeply shocking the residents of Newsburg who had dared to watch the battle from the harbor. The Horn Bay Alliance, as the strongest power in Horn Bay, had always prided itself on its naval strength. Although its navy had been at a disadvantage in this war with the Church, it wasn't due to any inherent weakness, but rather the loss of coastal cities one by one, weakening the navy due to lack of replenishment. But now, it seemed a more powerful force was rising at sea. The fierce naval battle continued into the afternoon, ultimately ending in the defeat and surrender of the Church fleet. Things are progressing better than expected. With a sea route secured, the Alliance should be able to recover somewhat. Hopefully, they still have gold in their treasury. When the news reached Hydra, the capital of the Duchy of Eaton, Mariana, who had returned to Horn Bay, breathed a sigh of relief. Thank God, Grand Duke Atia Cabre laughed heartily. If the southern front falls completely, we'll be in chaos here too. Don't be too happy, Marianne reminded him. Although Edwin Cook is gone, there's still Webster in the south. He was the one who brought the Church's initial victory. Besides, Giles' army has entered Horn Bay, and Eaton is the first to bear the brunt. You're right, we can't let our guard down. The Grand Duke regained his seriousness. Teacher, is the chaos in the Church's army outside Nijmsburg related to you? Helen asked softly. Half a month ago, Just when she and her husband were worried about the impending fall of their southern allies, Marianne suddenly appeared in Hydra. Her optimistic attitude towards the situation during their conversation puzzled Helen, but a few days later, news came that the church's protectors had broken camp and retreated. Marianne winked mischievously. It was a huge cauldron of boiling oil, and I just flicked a tiny spark into it. Or rather, a catalyst. Pretty clever, huh? That's a new term I learned in the Northwest Bay. Contrary to her outward ease, the red-haired woman felt a mix of emotions. Her son, Paul, had just fought the orcs in the north and was now facing the power of the papacy in Horn Bay. A person with a pioneering spirit will always face various challenges, that's growth. Marianne didn't know whether to be happy or worried. The papacy was far stronger than the orcs. But she was mostly optimistic. The papacy's influence spanned the continent, supported by churches everywhere. But just like the relationship between lord and vassal in a secular power system, even a king couldn't freely command his sworn subjects, let alone the papacy and local churches, whose dependence was weaker and whose control was more fragile. Horn Bay marked the beginning of the papacy's fall from grace, but not the end. An even greater blow was about to be dealt to it in the Gabella Empire. Chapter 733 The Imperial Guards deployed. In Gabella, the capital city and the largest city in the empire, a new dawn broke once more. The pristine white Scholars Tower stood tall, bathed in the golden light of the rising sun, like the scholars within, forever watching over this jewel-like city with a gaze of wisdom. The streets gradually came alive, soon bustling with traffic and noise, a scene of prosperity. But today was destined to be different. A series of rapid, synchronized footsteps alerted everyone. It was a troop of armored royal guards, marching from the direction of the palace, their faces grim as they advanced towards the south of the city. Wherever they passed, people scattered, doors and windows shut. The residents of the capital vividly remembered the martial law imposed after the prince's rebellion. Back then, the royal guards had been deployed, maintaining order in the streets and imprisoning those who dared to violate it. Although no formal martial law had been declared today, the deployment of the royal guards was certainly not a good sign. Everyone's best course of action was to remain hidden. Prince Felix once instigated a rebellion, attempting to assassinate his father and seize supreme power in the empire. At the crucial moment, another prince, Antonio, stepped forward, uniting those truly loyal to the empire and swiftly crushing his brother's plot. Emperor Bartley Griffin, heartbroken by his eldest son's betrayal, fell ill and never recovered. He entrusted the affairs of state to Prince Antonio and secluded himself in the palace, no longer involved in politics. This is the version known to the people of Gabella. After the prince's plot was thwarted, Antonio decisively implemented a series of measures to stabilize the capital. However, in other parts of the empire far from the capital, Felix's accomplices continued to rebel, and further north, savage orcs from the grasslands took advantage of the empire's instability to cross the desert and raid southwards, successively conquering several of the empire's oasis vassal states. As the Orcish army was about to reach the empire's homeland, Prince Antonio personally led his troops north. After a fierce battle, the orcs suffered a major setback, and the empire's strength forced them to turn west and plunder the Alder. Having temporarily stabilized the situation in the north, Antonio then focused his attention on the homeland. He first returned to the capital and held a grand coronation ceremony, placing the crown, symbolizing the empire's highest power, on his own head. The crown was placed on his son's head by Bartley Griffin himself. When the long-retired emperor reappeared in public, those who knew Bartley's face were all astonished. Once upon a time, the empire's subjects praised their emperor with a lion's face. His broad chest, strong arms, and lustrous hair all deserved such praise. But now, what appeared before them was only a weathered old man with dry hair. Only his tall frame vaguely revealed him as the former supreme ruler of Gabella. The eldest son's betrayal was a devastating blow to his majesty. Many felt deep pity for Bartley. The old emperor took the crown from the tray carried by his attendant and placed it firmly on the head of Antonio, who was kneeling before him. After his son rose, he examined it carefully to ensure the crown was proper. Bartley gently stroked his son's shoulder and said, "I know you are destined to be an extraordinary man. But since this country has been entrusted to you, I hope you will remember my heartfelt words." Antonio Griffin nodded. "Please speak, father." Bartley Griffin's expression seemed somewhat helpless and sorrowful. He was, after all, a former emperor who wielded immense power, yet he had to hand it over to another person while still alive, even his own son. It was understandable that he felt uncomfortable. This was the speculation of most who saw Bartley's expression. The old emperor said earnestly, "I learned the whole story from Aldrich. If it is true, the responsibility you bear is perhaps unparalleled in human history. However, many people use this responsibility as a reason to wield power recklessly. When the power harms innocent people, they gradually become accustomed to using their responsibility as an excuse or to numb themselves. Before, you could only influence yourself and those behind you. Now you are the emperor, and the entire nation is under your control. In the future, you may attain an even higher position, so," his tone carried a hint of worry, "in my capacity as the previous monarch, I implore you, to use your wisdom and power with caution." Antonio Griffin nodded solemnly. "Father, I will remember your teachings." He paused, then continued, "and steadfastly walk the path that destiny has shown me." Bartley Griffin breathed a sigh of relief, seemingly relieved to have fulfilled his final responsibility, then grasped Antonio's hand and raised it high before everyone. "Long live the Emperor!" A deafening roar instantly engulfed the entire coronation ceremony venue. The crowd celebrated the smooth transfer of supreme power, at least within the capital. Let the shadow of Felix's rebellion quickly dissipate. With the previous emperor's public endorsement, His Majesty Antonio gained unparalleled righteousness. Those rumors circulating privately, fratricide, patricide, collusion with sorcerers, became as foul as garbage from a sewer, shameless fabrications by Felix's remnants to defame the new emperor's sanctity. Immediately after his coronation, the new emperor, along with his trusted generals, Siegfried, MacDonald, Ambroff, and others, launched a series of campaigns to quell the rebellions instigated by Felix's remaining forces throughout the empire. It was observed that since Antonio came to power, the imperial army's combat strength seemed to have greatly increased. Soldiers were well trained, their morale high in battle, and they fought bravely. The equipment of some elite units had also been enhanced, their swords were sharper than the enemy's, and their armor stronger. Even more noteworthy was a new ranged weapon, a firearm capable of long-range firing. Unlike ballistae and catapults, its projectiles exploded in flames upon reaching the enemy, causing widespread damage. It was incredibly powerful. This terrifying weapon was said to have originated in the western kingdom of Walder, but its original version could only fire iron projectiles. The clever Gabaran craftsman improved the manufacturing technique, allowing the projectiles to explode, making it even more lethal. However, the new weapon still retained its name from Alder, the Thunder Hammer. "Alice, the Alder people are always like this," people would say proudly. "They get bored with their new gadgets and stop striving for improvement. If we're going to really get something truly innovative, we Gabaran have to be the ones who do it." Under the suppression of the powerful imperial army, the overall situation finally stabilized within a few years. Trade resumed, and cities throughout the empire returned to their former prosperity. Now, the reappearance of large numbers of imperial guards on the streets seems to foreshadow something ominous. So much time has passed, could it be that Felix's rebels have been discovered again in the city? Amidst the speculation, the Gabella Imperial Guards approached the largest church in the capital, the headquarters of the Gabella Church. Chapter 734 Dramatic Change. Amidst the panic, the Gabella Guard swiftly stormed into the church. Those inside had no time to react. Amidst terrified screams, loud shouts, and various other clamors, the soldiers blocked all entrances and exits, searching every room in the church. Archbishop Whiteman, presiding over the Gabella Church, quickly appeared. He stood tall and imposing, but without anger. Instead, he questioned the soldiers with a disdainful tone, asking who gave them the audacity to defend this sacred place. Because of his usual imposing presence, the guards did not show him any disrespect. However, when Ambroff, who commanded the guards, appeared, he immediately ordered the soldiers to chain the archbishop. The soldiers dared not disobey their superior's orders and proceeded with the chains. "You're insane." Once the cold shackles were on his wrists, Whiteman finally lost his previous composure and struggled in disbelief. He was the archbishop in charge of a diocese of the country. The emperor ruled the material world, while he ruled the spiritual world. Who in the empire dared to disrespect him? But what was happening now wasn't just a nightmare for Whiteman. The pampered archbishop couldn't withstand the strong Imperial Guard soldiers and could only repeatedly shout, "You're all insane." Ambroff walked up to him and stated his purpose in a stern tone. "We received a report that the Church of Gabella is colluding with the remnants of Felix's faction, So we are here on the Emperor's orders to search for evidence, slander. Utter slander. While this rebuttal was forceful, Whiteman was actually somewhat guilty. Because the Church of Gabella really was colluding with Felix's remnants. Before Antonio became emperor, the church disliked this prince, rumored to be born of a witch, and openly and secretly supported Prince Felix's ascension to the throne. In that momentous upheaval that determined the succession to the highest power in the empire, Antonio acted too swiftly. The church hadn't even had time to react before the situation was already decided, and they could only silently swallow the bitter pill. As for connections with various factions, that was certainly possible. Taking advantage of the new emperor's unstable foundation to overthrow him and gamble on it wasn't out of the question. However, with the new emperor's severe suppression of the rebellion, all the rebellious forces were eliminated one by one, and the Church of Gabella gradually accepted reality, planning to abandon everything from the past and instead cultivate good relations with the new emperor, Antonio. Always standing with the victor, this was the unwavering principle that churches everywhere had always followed. Unfortunately, they seemed to be a step too late. From the archbishop down to the servants, everyone in the church was shackled and held in the main hall. In this sacred place of prayer to the gods, those who were once dressed in fine clothes as representatives of the gods were reduced to lowly prisoners. Their former arrogance vanished, leaving only trembling bodies in fear of their uncertain fate. "It'll be all right," the archbishop whispered to a few trusted confidants in the crowd, reassuring them, "all the important letters have been burnt to ashes, no one will find them." Ahem. Ambov, who had just walked over, merely cleared his throat, but it was like a bolt from the blue for them. They trembled in fright and quickly stopped talking. "I regret to inform you, Archbishop Whiteman, that we have found evidence that the church under your leadership is colluding with the rebels." Ambov calmly displayed a piece of paper. "How is this possible?" Whiteman almost jumped up. He immediately turned his gaze to the paper in the other's hand. He first stared in surprise, then in uncontrollable rage forced every muscle in his body to twitch. This is slander. This is a shameful slander." The archbishop's voice was full of grievance. Unlike his previous guilty conscience, this time it was a complete outpouring of emotion. The so-called evidence in Ambov's hand contained content he had never seen before, and judging from the handwriting, it was neither his own nor anyone he knew. In other words, the Imperial Guard's initial goal was to accuse the Church of collusion and rebellion. Their feigned search was merely a formality. He was now truly terrified. If the Emperor only suspected them, he could present evidence, reason with them, and find a chance to escape. But the other side was determined to kill him from the start. Nothing he said mattered. "The Father will punish you. We beg the Holy See to uphold justice. We are innocent." Seeing the Archbishop's reaction, the prisoners instantly understood that an inevitable dark future was approaching, and they all made their final struggles in their own ways. Ambov merely sneered and waved his hand. "Take them all away." The Imperial Guard's raid on the Church of Gabella had a significant impact. Some devout believers, aligned with the church, gathered and marched in the streets, demanding the release of those who served God. The imperial government's attitude towards them was to suppress them all. Various powerful departments seemed to have been prepared long ago. The soldiers carrying out the mission were all rigorously selected, and each person placed orders above their faith. When the marching believers questioned them in the name of God, they were met with merciless clubs and chains. Years ago, the church's spiritual control over the people was so solid, but since the religious war at Horn Bay, this solid spiritual wall had cracked. The Protestant Alliance and the various heresy ideas spreading from them reminded people that the Church of Light was not equivalent to the Lord of Light himself. These heretical ideas spread increasingly widely, whether intentionally or unintentionally, from whispered conversations between couples in bed to whispers in taverns, and from whispers in taverns to open sermons in the square. Previously, the Church often demanded the cooperation of secular authorities to severely suppress these heretical ideas, but now secular authorities were becoming increasingly passive in this regard. The Gabella Church was quickly convicted of rebellion and treason, and the imperial government even used this opportunity to investigate related cases concerning the Church. Numerous shameful and blatantly unethical acts, clearly violating the code of conduct for clergy, were exposed, along with the extravagant and corrupt private lives of many high-ranking church officials, severely damaging the church's prestige. While Whiteman and others were being tried and convicted, Emperor Antonio Griffin of Gabella quickly issued a decree appointing a new Archbishop of Gabella. Like a huge stone thrown into a calm lake, the emperor's decree instantly created ripples, shocking the entire continent. Appointing archbishops of various churches was traditionally the prerogative of the papacy, and naturally, the papacy was furious at the Gabella Emperor's actions. When the papacy's envoy traveled thousands of miles to the Gabella capital to demand answers, he was not even granted an audience with the emperor himself. Only a low-ranking official of etiquette received the envoy and solemnly informed him that from this day forward, everything in Gabella would be decided by the people of Gabella themselves, both materially and spiritually. The messenger was forbidden from contacting local church personnel and could only return to the holy city in disgrace, bringing back only a humiliating notification. The Vatican was furious, but at the moment it couldn't spare the energy to deal with Gabella, as it was itself mired in the quagmire of Horn Bay. The higher-ups realized that if the chaos in Horn Bay wasn't ended quickly, cases like Gabella's could become increasingly common. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 735. Following instructions from Lakeside Town, a civilian armed group called the Horn Bay Volunteer Army was established in Lion Harbor. Although officially called a civilian armed group, its core land force actually consisted of 3 battalions of the Alda Marine Corps and 6 newly added Army battalions, totaling more than 5,000 officers and soldiers from the Northwest Bay. Due to formal intervention in the Horn Bay War and considering the possibility of future land-based military operations, the Horn Bay Volunteer Army's command structure was adjusted. The naval fleet remained under the command of Fleet Commander Quake, while the land military forces, including the Marine Corps, were now under the command of Major General Andrew, who had accompanied the infantry battalion. He had been promoted from the former commander of the 4th Infantry Battalion, the former commander of the Bayhorn Battalion. With the expansion of the army, the Alda Army added ranks above colonel, including senior colonel, major general, lieutenant general, and general. Currently, Quake and Andrew are both major generals. In addition to the regular army from the Northwest Bay, there were 15,000 local Horn Bay mercenaries as auxiliary forces. This mercenary force was originally formed from Horn Bay mercenary prisoners of war during the War of the Usurpers. Lakeside Town transported them back to Horn Bay and recruited locals to supplement their current size. Due to the changing situation, the mercenaries' mission expanded from maintaining order and protecting property to participating in combat. Their organizational structure and organization were also changed to be identical to the Alda Army. In order not to hinder the regular army, their training intensity was also increased, providing a ready-made training model for the infantry manual compiled by Claude and others in Crystal Radiance for the new Royal Army. After assisting in lifting the naval blockade of Nisberg, the Horn Bay Volunteer Army attempted to organize an expedition to completely annihilate the remnants of the retreating Apostolic Guard. However, when the Alder soldiers left the coastal city and entered the Horn Bay interior, the seemingly beautiful tropical forests suddenly revealed their ferocious and terrifying side to these guests from the northern continent. Vicious snakes and insects, poisonous miasma, dangerous plants. In short, the Alder soldiers' acclimatization problems worsened significantly, and disease began to spread within the army. Many suffered from vomiting and diarrhea, even fever and coma, severely impacting their mobility. Sometimes, willpower alone cannot overcome the difficulties of reality. General Andrew realized his army might be swallowed up by the environment before even encountering the enemy, and he also questioned the independent combat capabilities of his mercenaries. Therefore, he withdrew the army to conduct acclimatization training on the edge of the forest. Simultaneously, he allocated a portion of his forces to assist the Protestant Alliance in retaking the fallen coastal cities, alongside the navy. Capturing cities protected by thick walls on land was difficult, even for the older army equipped with artillery. While a prolonged siege was a good option to avoid casualties, it consumed a great deal of time. Therefore, the Horn Bay Volunteer Army chose a faster method for operations against coastal cities, an invasion from the sea. In the Age of Sail, navies once had a rule: ships should not be foolish enough to engage land-based artillery in a direct confrontation. However, this approach didn't work here, because the Alda Navy's opponents weren't equipped with artillery. The only active defense equipment they could deploy in the port was long-range melee weapons like ballistae. Naturally, these relatively outdated firepower points couldn't compete with the combined range and firepower of naval guns. The Alden navy sailed outside the port, adjusted their ships, aimed their cannons, and systematically eliminated the firepower points one by one. Then, the Marines, in small boats under artillery cover, entered the port, cranking winches to remove the chains obstructing the ship's entry. This often meant the city was already in their grasp. In the old days, when armies defended cities, if there were thick city walls, the defenders could put up a tenacious resistance. But once the walls fell, the defenders' morale would immediately plummet, and they would have no courage to engage in urban warfare. For the sake of trade convenience, the coastal cities of Horn Bay were often laid out with a port directly connecting to the city center, without complex obstacles in between. The defensive forces deployed by the papacy's apologists there were mainly recruited from local believers who still supported the church. They were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and demoralized due to the local skepticism stemming from their allegiance to the papacy. Their fighting capacity was predictably low. Often, before the Marines even landed, the port garrison would scatter, and soon the citizens would spontaneously bind the papacy's appointed officials and surrender to the vanguard. Overall, while the papacy's apologists were busy recovering from their wounds, the recapture of the Protestant Alliance's coastal cities proceeded relatively smoothly. It took Niceburg nearly 6 months to restore control of its coastal territories, finally restoring it to a relatively respectable state. It attempted to rebuild a powerful armed force, eager to avenge its previous defeat in the next phase of the war. The retreating papacy's apologists, and the Horn Bay Church and the papacy behind them, were not idle. Pope Harrington II and the high-ranking officials of the papacy reached a consensus on the current situation. The matter of Gabella would be put aside for the time being, and the priority should be to extinguish the flames of heresy in Horn Bay. They lifted all restrictions, including providing massive support to Horn Bay via sea and land transport, including soldiers, weapons, and money, and rearmed a recovering papacy army. With the direct support of the papacy, Webster, who had previously been relegated to a secondary role, was reinstated as commander of the papacy army once again. Webster's experience was quite legendary. At the beginning of the Horn Bay War, the papacy army's northern flanking strategy suffered heavy losses, while on the southern front, the heretical army, led by the valiant Horn Bay Alliance General Vasquez, advanced eastward, reaching Moorburg, not far from Collins. Just when the papacy army and the Horn Bay Church were on the verge of collapse, the papacy dispatched Webster with troops to their aid. He defeated Vasquez's Protestant army at Moorburg, and then pushed back all the way to the territory of the most powerful Protestant alliance, the Horn Bay Alliance. However, at this time, the short-sighted Horn Bay Church believed victory was assured and advocated sending a portion of its forces north to attack Eton and other countries, aiming to wipe out all heretics as quickly as possible. The cautious Webster rejected this plan, insisting on concentrating forces to eliminate the leader of the Horn Bay Alliance, a blasphemous alliance. This caused the Horn Bay Church to harbor resentment towards him, and after some maneuvering, they sidelined Webster, replacing him with Edwin Cook, also sent by the papacy. The Horn Bay Church facilitated and executed a plan to divide their forces for the attack. Cook led half of the planned army to attack Niceburg, but ultimately failed to capture it and died in a mutiny. Chapter 736. General Webster was once again entrusted with a critical mission. Whether as a devout believer or a loyal soldier, he could not refuse this responsibility. He inspected the troops, revitalizing their spirits with an inspiring speech. He dispatched envoys to the various countries within Horn Bay, urging them to continue their support. Webster ensured the fair and equitable distribution of the various supplies allocated by the papacy, earning the respect of all. The papacy's troops were replenished, and their equipment was maintained and updated, gradually returning to its peak strength under the general's tireless efforts. Meanwhile, at Webster's insistence, another force that had been advancing north to attack Eton was recalled, joining the main force. The papacy's troops would once again unite as one to strike a decisive blow against the enemy. Among the troops joining from the north was a special group, the army of Grand Duke Giles of Alder South. They had arrived in Horn Bay as mercenaries, fighting under the employment of the Horn Bay Church. Considering the so-called Horn Bay Volunteer Army of the Protestant Alliance, the fact that the two most powerful lords of Alder, one in the north and one in the south, were clashing on the land of another country was considered a spectacle, and many privately regarded it as a symbolic event signifying the irrecoverable decline of Alder's power. The morale of the pacifist army was restored. Recalling that at the beginning of the war, they too had been pushed back, but they had pushed back again, Now they would recreate that miracle. The states of Eton and others to the north of Horn Bay, upon discovering the retreat of the enemy forces that had advanced on their territory, immediately understood the enemy's intentions based on the current situation. At Marianne's request, an army composed of northern states of the Protestant Alliance sailed south to support their ally, the Horn Bay Alliance. Because they also had to defend their own territories, this support army was not large. Who could be sure that the southward march of the Northern Pacifist Army was not a feint? But the delegation was sincere enough, led by Grand Duke Otto Cabre himself, accompanied by his wife Helen and Helen's tutor Marianne, whose identity remained a secret. The situation in the Horn Bay War briefly calmed down, but everyone knew this was merely the calm before the storm. Both sides were preparing for a decisive battle. In any case, the Protestant Union was exhausted, its strength only enough for a final, desperate gamble. The papacy, on the other hand, was far from Horn Bay, and supporting the Horn Bay Church would come at a heavy price. This could have been resolved through Aldo's maritime trade routes, mainly in the Northwest Bay, requiring only financial support. However, Cullen's attack on Lion Harbor pushed Aldo merchants to the opposite side, making papacy aid to Horn Bay increasingly difficult without this vital supplier route. Therefore, the impending battle might be the final war in Horn Bay's history. Many with foresight could see that the outcome of this battle would, in a sense, determine the fate of the world. If the papacy's forces win, the papacy will largely regain its prestige and control of Horn Bay, a vital trading hub considered a cornerstone of the continent, allowing it to focus its efforts on dealing with Gabella. However, if the Protestant Alliance wins, the papacy will suffer a humiliating defeat. Its self-proclaimed role as God's representative will be shattered. How could God allow his representatives to fail? More nations will follow suit, and the papacy's authority will be eroded by repeated blows. Various powers dispatched spies and agents to Horn Bay, closely monitoring the situation. Finally, amidst the intense anticipation of the world, the final battle began. The papacy's forces, having rested sufficiently, were ordered by Webster to advance westward once more. Upon learning this, the Protestant Alliance immediately dispatched troops to intercept them. The Protestant army, including the Horn Bay Volunteers, numbered approximately 45,000, while the Anglican army comprised 48,000. The two sides clashed head-on in an open area called Hestia, each deploying its formations for a major battle. Since the Horn Bay Volunteers comprised the largest force among the Protestants, Andrew naturally became their overall commander. The Horn Bay Volunteers were positioned in the very center of their battle formation. Alda's 9 battalions employed their usual linear tactics, consisting of several shallow lines. The mercenaries and other allied forces used traditional phalanx formations. The second largest force, the Horn Bay Alliance Army, was deployed on the right flank, while the forces of Eton and other nations were positioned on the left. The Anglican army, deployed entirely in phalanx formations, arrived at the battlefield before their opponents, securing higher ground and a significant advantage in visibility. In the initial period after the initial encounter, neither side was certain of the other's strength, and neither dared to launch a full-scale attack. The fighting mainly consisted of small-scale cavalry skirmishes, probing each other's weaknesses. However, it wasn't long before Arden's artillery was deployed, using its range advantage to bombard the Protestant phalanx, inflicting considerable casualties on the Protestants who were facing such weapons for the first time in reality. Webster ordered the ballistae and other long-range weapons to be moved forward to counter the Protestant artillery. Arden's gunners changed targets, concentrating their fire on the enemy's ranged units. Superior craftsmanship and ample training meant that Arden's artillery accuracy was somewhat free from luck. Seeing his own long-range projectiles being destroyed one by one, General Fedotov, in command of the Protestant cavalry, lost his composure. This valiant general had once led the Protestants in a force-flanking maneuver through the neutral states north of the Diagon Bay, but upon reaching Eton territory, he had been ambushed by a group of evil wizards, suffering a humiliating defeat. Arden's artillery reminded him of those unpleasant memories. Back then, amidst fire and roar, his army had crumbled under mysterious attacks, ultimately suffering a crushing defeat. Fedotov had sworn to reclaim his glory on the battlefield, and the flag bearing the Duke of Eton's banner in the enemy ranks drove him to madness. Seeing the enemy resort to evil magic once more, Fedotov could no longer contain himself. "Tell the lads to prepare for a charge," his adjutant cried out in alarm. "General, Lord Webster hasn't given the order yet." Fedotov's expression hardened. "God above! Webster doesn't know the horrors of that magic. We must kill the wizards hidden in their ranks before that terrible fiery explosion occurs. Or at least create chaos to disrupt their spellcasting, he commanded without room for argument. Send word to Webster. The rest of you, follow me in charge. And so, amidst the neighing of their war horses, Fedotov led his cavalry in a charge towards the enemy's left flank, the very spot where the Duke of Eaton's banner flew. The cavalry charge kicked up a huge cloud of dust, visible from afar. Andrew immediately ordered the left flank to prepare for battle, forming a pike formation to meet the enemy's assault. Webster, the commander of the papacy, was furious. He roared in the direction of the dust, "You've destroyed all my honor and reputation." Chapter 737 Diagonal Attack. Seeing the billowing dust ahead, the entire Protestant army realized the real battle was about to begin. Andrew was worried about whether the armies of Eton and other nations could withstand this fierce charge. He ordered the 3rd Marine Battalion, as reserves, to quickly move to the left flank to support their allies there. Fedotov's cavalry moved swiftly, soon approaching the Protestant army's left flank. These skilled priestly knights, wielding maces and longswords, engaged the infantry in their phalanx. Bang! 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 A series of explosions rang out, and a large cloud of smoke obscured the left flank of the battle. Just as the two sides were locked in a fierce struggle, the timely arrival of the 3rd Marine Battalion joined the fray, a burst of musket fire sending nearby priestly knights flying. Evil magic. Fedotov believed his suspicions had been confirmed. What else could those strange, fiery, and smoking attacks be but magic? He was completely driven by a fearless spirit, leading his men in a brave charge towards the Marines. These soldiers from Arda quickly changed formation, switching from their original line formation to hollow square. Fedotov's cavalry launched attack after attack, but this seemingly weak square remained unmoved. No matter which direction the papacy's cavalry attacked from, they were always met with a hail of bullets and a jungle of bayonets. They were astonished. When they charged at other, weaker infantry, the enemy was terrified by their charge, either scattering in panic or desperately trying to squeeze behind others. But this strange army could hold its ground, crouching or standing, each person seemingly rooted to the spot. The problem was that their horses, unfamiliar with this kind of attack with its roar and smoke, became terrified and extremely difficult to control. "Shoot the horses! Shoot the horses!" The battalion commander of the 3rd Battalion roared hoarsely from the Marines' formation, reminding his inexperienced soldiers of their priority targets. Because of their larger size, horses were more vulnerable to musket fire. Wounded or dead horses hindered the cavalry charge from behind, and the surviving horses, witnessing the carnage of their comrades and terrified by the gunfire and flames, darted wildly, significantly diminishing the effectiveness of the papal cavalry's charge. Consumed by rage, Fedotov disregarded all this, frantically whipping the reins to urge his horse onward. Suddenly, an unexpected attack occurred. A cavalryman ahead of him was struck, his horse spurting a shocking amount of blood before collapsing. Fedotov's mount, unable to rein in time, was tripped and thrown from its back. Fedotov felt a sudden dizziness before tumbling to the ground. He quickly struggled to his feet, assessing his condition. Fortunately, it seemed no bones were broken. General, the adjutant stopped beside him, dismounted, helped him up, and offered his own horse to Fedotov. "Commander Webster has given us new orders," the adjutant relayed from the messenger they had just met. "You must hold the enemy's left flank. He will lead the main force to break through the enemy's right flank before supporting you. Send word back." "We can definitely do it." Fedotov nodded heavily and continued to command his cavalry to attack the Protestant army's left flank. The continuous artillery bombardment created vast clouds of smoke, severely obstructing the vision of both sides. The right flank of the papacy and the left flank of the Protestant army were now locked in combat. The infantry phalanxes of Eton and other nations, with their marine battalions as the backbone, were struggling to hold on and avoid being scattered by the enemy. Amidst this chaotic situation, the papacy's commander, Webster, keenly spotted an opportunity. The Horn Bay Alliance army was positioned on the Protestant army's right flank. He had investigated and found that the Corner Bay Alliance had just formed an army after recovering from the brink of national subjugation. Newly formed armies often have various problems, and Webster, after a moment's thought, quickly determined his main attack direction. Since that reckless Fedotov had already led his cavalry to attack the enemy's left flank, he might as well go with the flow and hold off the enemy there. He decisively ordered a diagonal attack on the Protestant army's right flank. Several infantry squares of the Protestant army moved according to Webster's orders, their lines gradually shifting from left to right, no longer parallel to the Protestant army, but forming an angle. Their left flank was closer to the enemy, while the right flank was slightly further away, advancing towards the enemy in a trapezoidal formation. The diagonal tactic, also known as the inclined tactic, was Webster and his army's most proficient tactic. In the engagement, the flank closer to the enemy engages first, while the slightly farther flank provides pinpoint damage. Once the engaged flank breaks through the corresponding enemy flank, it immediately flanks the exposed enemy lines and launches an attack on the enemy's rear. Meanwhile, the previously farther flank attacks the enemy's front. Through coordinated attacks from the front and flanks, the enemy's lines are disrupted, their fighting spirit crushed, and victories achieved at a lower cost than a direct frontal battle. This is Webster's diagonal tactic. Clearly, the success of the diagonal tactic depends on whether the first flank to engage can defeat the enemy. Among the opposing Protestant army, the newly rebuilt but severely undertrained Bayhorn Alliance army is undoubtedly an excellent target. They are deployed precisely on the Protestant army's right flank, making them the primary target of the diagonally moving Guardians. The Guardians have a numerical advantage in cavalry, deployed on both flanks. Their left-wing cavalry, in coordination with the diagonal tactic, launches the first attack on the Bayhorn Alliance army on the Protestant army's right flank. In an instant, the sound of hooves overwhelmed the right flank of the Protestant army, the battle cries deafening. "Don't panic. They won't dare charge," the commanders of the Bayhorn Alliance army roared, their voices hoarse as they maintained discipline, ordering their soldiers not to run amok and to brace their lances against the ground with the tips pointing outwards. The best they could achieve was that their soldiers didn't immediately collapse. Those soldiers, inexperienced in battle, saw the large number of tall horses charging towards them. Their legs trembled uncontrollably, their arms went limp, and they couldn't even grip their lances. The Protestant cavalry, composed of skilled riders and knights with fervent faith in the papacy, knew how to peel back the layers of the infantry phalanx, a swift strike followed by a break, never lingering, gradually eroding the enemy's morale. Just as the Bayhorn Alliance army was exhausted from the cavalry harassment, the Protestant infantry arrived on the left flank and immediately launched a real attack. Under such pressure, the Alliance infantry phalanx collapsed in no time. Chapter 738. Damn it, Andrew, peering through his binoculars, was struck by the catastrophic scene unfolding on the right flank. Once the first phalanx collapsed, it was like a domino effect, the other phalanxes followed suit, one by one. The Bayhorn Alliance was in complete disarray, soldiers running desperately to the rear, each wishing they had more legs. Clearly, these guys were unorganized. 2/5 of the Protestant army had been lost in an instant, leaving the flank wide open. The 10 mercenary battalions of the Bayhorn Volunteer Army were forced to become the new right flank. The situation was urgent. Andrew acted decisively, ordering the 10 mercenary battalions to make a right-angle turn, facing the advancing enemy left flank, forming a new defensive line to protect the center. "Is this really all right?" Mariana asked anxiously beside him. "Madam, although they are locals from Bayhorn Bay, they were all trained according to our methods, each one excellent. Please have confidence," Andrew assured her, patting his chest. Mariana arrived by sea with the Eton army and met both Andrew and Quake. Although neither of them were old retainers of Earl Giles, they were still quite different. During the war against the Orcs, Marianne stayed by Paul's side. The Navy didn't play a significant role in that war, and Quake was either in Flanders or at sea, so he hadn't seen her. However, Andrew, who accompanied Paul, had seen Marianne and immediately connected her to Earl Giles' beautiful wife. As a nobleman from Barden, he had seen Marianne as the Lady of Ardor when he was young. At that time, the Giles family's official explanation for Marianne's departure was that she had died young from illness. Seeing her again after so many years, Andrew initially thought it was just someone else who looked very similar, and it seemed too illogical that her appearance hadn't changed at all over the years. But as he noticed that this red-haired woman was often with Paul, his doubts grew. Finally, he couldn't help but ask Paul about it, and the answer he received astonished him. This red-haired woman was indeed the former matriarch of the Giles family. Paul's attitude towards his mother's return was that he wouldn't bring it up unless asked, but he wouldn't hide it if asked. Of course, this didn't include Marianne's identity as a spellcaster. As for the reason Marianne ran away from home, he used a very reasonable explanation. to bid farewell to the mortal world in the name of death and find a secluded place to practice asceticism, a practice not uncommon among devout and fanatical believers. However, Marianne later disappeared again, and then Andrew saw her with the Grand Duchess of Eton. He was puzzled as to why old Lady Gleman was traveling all over the world. I wanted to see the sights while I was still healthy. I traveled to Cape Bay and was fortunate enough to become friends with Princess Helen. The red-haired lady gave him a vague, or rather, clumsy, explanation. But Andrew didn't have time to delve deeper. He simply wrote a hasty letter to Paul reporting Lady Gleman's whereabouts before throwing himself into the tense military affairs. But then, Marianne had somehow ended up on the battlefield. Upon seeing this, Andrew immediately ordered his guards to keep a close watch on her. At this moment on the battlefield, not only Marianne, but everyone unfamiliar with the Alda army turned their attention to the mercenaries who were turning away. Hurry up. Get back to your positions, get your spirits up, don't embarrass us, Doug and Fergus commanded their men with booming voices, waving their arms and shouting. These two former mercenary leaders still held the title of leader, but more specifically, they were leaders within the Alda army's organizational structure. After being incorporated into Alda, they and their men finally enjoyed a period of peace, no longer having to live a life of constant danger and risking their lives for money. Military instructors from the Northwest Gulf disciplined these mercenaries with a rigorous and chilling system, adopting Alda army standards in all aspects except for weaponry. However, while peaceful life was certainly desirable, living such uneventful days was also quite monotonous. The entry of Lionport into the war thrilled Doug and Fergus, who quickly volunteered to join the army and navy in the fighting, or rather, to provide assistance. The Alda army had a clear system of rewards and punishments, and they yearned for a war that would allow them to advance further within the system. Watching the chaotic right flank of the Horn Bay Volunteer Army, Webster, on the high ground, burst into laughter. Having wiped out 2/5 of the enemy's forces, he believed the outcome of the battle was already a foregone conclusion. However, things took an unexpected turn. The mercenaries moved swiftly, kicking up dust, and soon they formed square formations, presenting a wide front to the sweeping Christian army. "How is this possible?" Webster exclaimed, witnessing this. Such a large-scale maneuver, especially when facing a powerful enemy head-on, what army or soldier could maintain such order? But the so-called Horn Bay Volunteer Army had done it. Quickly. "Charge! Seize this opportunity," Webster roared, directing his soldiers to continue the assault via messenger. High spirits and unstoppable momentum, the left flank of the Guardian Army, responsible for engaging the enemy, was greatly encouraged after routing the Bayhorn Alliance forces. Under their commander's strict orders, they didn't pursue the fleeing Bayhorn Alliance soldiers but immediately attacked the right flank of the Bayhorn Volunteer Army. However, no one expected these mercenaries, trained by instructor Alda, to change formation so quickly. The Guardian Army soldiers shouted slogans and rammed into the solid human wall. Although the mercenaries lacked firearms, their spears were formidable, and they engaged the oncoming enemy in fierce combat. "It's time for us to catch them off guard," Andrew resolved to change the current passive situation. He gave the order, "Center, advance. Attack the junction of the enemy's echelon formation." Immediately, the 8 battalions deployed in the center, including the Marines, unleashed a rapid drumbeat. Under the officers' unified commands, the soldiers gripped their muskets tightly, their feet striking the drumbeats, and charged towards the enemy's encirclement. Infantry attacked, artillery led the way. As they began to move, the artillery began clearing a path for them. Instantly, accompanied by a deafening roar, bullets rained down on the moving enemy. Chapter 739 The Victory of Protestantism. In this battle, the Alda army deployed 10 6-pounder cannons and 4 12-pounder cannons. Following Andrew's orders, the artillery concentrated their fire in a salvo, bombarding the center of the Apostolic Army's echelon formation. The combined might of 14 cannons was immense, its roar echoing across the entire battlefield, shaking everyone to their core. High-speed shells slammed into the Apostolic Army's squares, bouncing merrily on the ground, creating a bloody spectacle. No flesh and blood could withstand these metal spheres imbued with immense energy, until they finally sank to the ground, their energy depleted. The Apostolic Army soldiers screamed in agony, their shields and armor offered no protection, as fragile as cheese against the incoming shells. The Alda artillery targeted a single square at a time, and the first salvo was remarkably effective. This was mainly due to the enemy's proactive offensive, which significantly closed the distance between the two armies, multiplying the accuracy and destructive power. From the perspective of the Apostolic Guard, the fifth square from the left looked as if it had been stabbed repeatedly by several invisible giants wielding thick wooden clubs. Large numbers of soldiers were killed or wounded, and those who remained stood were scattered and disorganized, staring in terror at their comrades screaming in agony on the ground. Morale plummeted, and fear grips everyone's heart. And soon enough, the Arda infantry, advancing at a brisk trot, brought them within firing range. "Halt!" the commander shouted. Because of the rapid movement, the infantry's line of fire had become somewhat disheveled, but they maintained a general formation, and within 15 seconds of the order, they were back in perfect formation. Aim, fire. The soldiers executed the orders flawlessly. Their rigorous daily training had etched these movements into their muscle memory. Immediately, another deafening roar erupted, sounding to the opposing Apostolic Guard soldiers like countless popping sounds of beans being fried. Amidst bursts of fire and thick smoke, countless metal projectiles, moving too fast for them to see clearly, pierced the already ravaged square formation. Soldiers in the front rows instantly burst into a spray of blood and collapsed to the ground. "Ah, devil!" the soldiers in the square screamed in terror, scattering like birds. Webster stared in disbelief at the square formation that had been intact just moments before, now reduced to a pile of corpses and wounded soldiers unable to move. At the beginning of the battle, due to the distance and the scattered firing of the Alda artillery, the casualties were still manageable for the Apostolic Guard. But as the distance closed and the Alda army concentrated their firepower, unleashing a continuous barrage of artillery and musket fire, the casualties skyrocketed, along with the immense psychological impact. In terms of actual effect, the firepower output just now only caused a few hundred casualties to a square formation of over 2,000 men. Although this casualty rate was already high for armies of the old era, it was not fatal to some highly motivated and well-trained elite troops. What was frightening was that this casualty occurred in a short period of time in a rapid, violent, and irresistible manner, rather than the casualties caused by soldiers fighting face-to-face, one-on-one, sword and gun. This was a huge blow to the Apostolic nation. Because of the collapse of this square formation, the Apostolic nation's trapezoidal diagonal offensive almost came to a halt, and a large gap appeared in their overall formation. Webster, who had just realized this, was furious. He ordered his men to wave command flags repeatedly, urging the troops behind the trapezoidal formation to block the gap and concentrate their attack on the enemy soldiers who were armed with flamethrowers and formed a thin line. Although the Apostolic nation's officers and soldiers hesitated, they still carried out their commander's orders and advanced towards the Arda army's infantry line. The Arda artillery commander immediately divided the artillery into two groups, firing at the enemy approaching from the left and right flanks respectively. This greatly slowed their movement, while the infantry were left to deal with the enemy troops approaching from the front. Aim, fire, aim, fire. Between bursts of gunfire, the officers' commands rang out continuously. Apart from a Marine battalion sent to the left flank to support the forces of Eton and other nations, over 4,000 Arda soldiers remained to lead the frontal assault. The units were arranged in 3 rows, forming a very wide front. Facing the approaching enemy, the officers adopted a rotational firing tactic, inflicting continuous casualties on the enemy through a relentless barrage of fire. The defenders, suffering such a blow, slowly advanced, shields now useless. But watching their comrades fall one after another, they hesitated, their hesitation quickly turning to fear. Once the first turned back, a large number followed suit, and the entire column retreated until they reached what they considered a safe distance. They didn't scatter in disarray, but maintained their formation, ultimately daring not to advance further. Seeing the enemy's retreat, Andrew, of course, wouldn't let this opportunity pass. He immediately ordered his troops to continue advancing, while the artillery moved forward to provide support. Thus, the defenders' originally orderly diagonal trapezoidal formation was severely disrupted, forced into 2 parts. Their original left flank, the one at the forefront, remained embroiled in the chaotic fighting with the Tungjiaoan mercenaries, while the middle and right flanks were constantly forced back by the Alda infantry, and the gap between the 2 parts widened. Webster, sensing he was about to lose control of his army, remembered his remaining cavalry at a crucial moment. He immediately sent for Fedotov to return and reinforce the advancing Arda army from the flank. In fact, Fedotov already knew of the changing situation and, realizing the gravity of the situation, immediately rallied his cavalry, abandoning the engagement with the Etonian and other armies, and turned to support the central battlefield. We can't let him succeed. Catch them. The Grand Duke of Eton, watching the departing enemy cavalry, ordered his troops to pursue at full speed. Risking a counterattack by the enemy cavalry, the Etonian and other armies took off, rushing towards the central battlefield. Finally, through their efforts, Fedodov's plan failed. When he saw his main force torn in two, knowing he was powerless to turn the tide, and facing the pursuing Etonian army, he dared not risk being caught in a pincer movement, and led his cavalry in retreat. We've lost. The soldiers on the far left flank of Webster's diagonal attack, seeing their allies fail to arrive, finally realized the dire situation and collapsed in disarray. Some surrendered, others fled for their lives. This marked the beginning of a plague-like defeat that spread throughout the Protestant army. Webster was both furious and deeply resentful. He waved his command flag, sent messengers, and even went himself, issuing order after order in an attempt to salvage the situation. But to his anguish, no army would obey his commands anymore. Finally, he lost control of the entire army. Now, the only order he could issue that everyone would obey was retreat. Watching the Protestant army advance from the left, center, and right, Webster reluctantly issued this humiliating order. Chapter 740 Pressing the Blade. The Protestant army, following Webster's orders, retreated from the battlefield of Hestia. The hasty retreat, hastily initiated due to defeat, quickly escalated into chaos. The hastily fleeing soldiers first stormed the rear supply depots, looting indiscriminately. Those who arrived later clashed with those who had arrived earlier, these men who claimed to fight for God disregarding the teachings of the scriptures, wrestling and even drawing their swords against each other over small valuables. Those who prioritized survival fled along side paths, resulting in a massive, scrambled mass of people unable to move. The Protestant army, naturally seizing this opportunity, pursued relentlessly under Andrew's orders. Even the scattered Horn Bay Alliance troops regrouped, shouting and yelling as they chased after the previously arrogant Protestant soldiers. The Protestant Alliance achieved a complete victory at the Battle of Hestia. According to the statistics after the battlefield cleanup, the Protestant army killed over 8,000 and captured over 15,000, while the Guardians of the Church suffered a total loss of over 23,000, a devastating defeat. The Protestant army, on the other hand, lost fewer than 3,000 men, including those from the ineffective Horn Bay Alliance forces. Having witnessed the entire battle, the Crimson Witch Marianne once again raised her opinion of her eldest son's army. Undoubtedly, the Alda army was the core of this battle. When the Horn Bay Alliance forces on the right flank collapsed, it was the mercenaries belonging to the Alda army who, with astonishing speed, completed a dramatic turn in front of the enemy, re-establishing the right flank of the entire army. The quality they displayed during this repositioning was truly remarkable. From the collapse of their allies to rebuilding the right flank, the time given to them was incredibly short. If it were any other army, they might not have had time to regroup before the Guardians of the Church, attacking from the right, would have dealt them a heavy blow like a hammer. As the Apostolic Guard advanced in a diagonal formation, the Arda infantry, in a decisive line, charged forward. Supported by artillery fire, they shattered the central part of the Apostolic Guard's echelon formation, effectively cleaving the enemy in two. The coordination between the Arda infantry and artillery was flawless, as the artillery cleared obstacles for the advancing infantry. Not a single shell hit its own comrades. Marianne, while admiring the performance, also felt a pang of regret. Her son's army had performed so well that she hadn't even had the chance to unleash her trump card, to let magic become the decisive force that turned the tide for the second time. Her original plan was to replicate the miracle at Eton, gathering the power of all the spellcasters to unleash a massive fireball to wipe out Webster when the Protestant army was on the verge of defeat, turning the tide of the Protestant war. This would elevate the spellcasters' standing in the eyes of the people once more. Well, that wouldn't be bad. After the regret subsided, a surge of pride rose within Marianne, this time for Paul Gleman. News of the Battle of Hestia spread like wildfire throughout the Horn Bay region and then continued to reach other parts of the continent. Cities along the Horn Bay coast erupted in jubilation. The people of the Protestant Union could hardly believe that the situation, which had been so precarious just moments before, had reversed so dramatically. Meanwhile, the inland nations that supported the Horn Bay Church were generally disheartened, their rulers attempting to suppress the news or claim that the Battle of Hestia was merely a minor setback. Unwilling to accept defeat, Webster rallied his forces and wrote to the papacy requesting greater support. But the reply from the Holy City shattered his hopes. The papacy refused his request, stating that it was impossible to endlessly pour resources into the bottomless pit of Horn Bay, especially after Alder's merchant fleet refused to provide services to the papacy. The papacy's leadership instructed Webster to strive for victory using the resources available at hand. Go. Heavenly Father will forever protect his beloved children. Webster gritted his teeth as he finished the last sentence, then tore the letter to shreds in front of the messenger with trembling hands. While Webster was overwhelmed with rebuilding his army for the second time, a distant reinforcement rekindled his fighting spirit. Giles' army had arrived. They had set out from the southern border of Alder, originally intending to attack the city-states in northern Horn Bay that sided with the Protestant Alliance. However, the Horn Bay Church repeatedly sent messengers demanding they continue south to join Webster, threatening to withhold their commission. Giles made a slight compromise, significantly increasing his demands, before his army entered the Horn Bay interior, using church-controlled territory to advance further south. But before they arrived, Webster, believing he had regained the upper hand, led his army westward. When they reached Collins, they found Webster leading his defeated troops in retreat. The commander of Giles' army was a viscount named Fernando Peyton. He rebuked Webster for launching the attack before their arrival, arguing that if the undead army appeared on the battlefield of Hestia, they would surely give those rural people from the northwest, who only knew how to frighten people with their gimmicks, a taste of their own medicine. Webster, who desperately needed reinforcements, unusually displayed humility, admitting his mistake and hoping his new ally would help him regain victory. Thus, another great battle broke out in Collins, with Peyton leading 3,000 undead soldiers and 3,000 auxiliary infantry as the main force of the Holy See. The spellcasters recruited by Giles proved invaluable, allowing their employer to continue to possess the secret potions that maintained the undead army's formidable fighting power. Although the effects were slightly inferior to the original potions provided by the Arcane Society, they were entirely under Giles' control, free from any constraints. Therefore, the Grand Duke of Greed felt confident enough to send so many undead soldiers to Horn Bay at once. For this battle, Peyton learned from the previous night raid on Lionport by Dirk Doyle. According to the wizard's recollections, his soldiers were felled one by metal projectiles. After discussing the Battle of Hestia with Webster, he confirmed the Arda army's attack methods. The inability to withstand the Yankees' fire weapons must be due to insufficient armor. Peyton decided to further strengthen his soldiers' defenses. When the Protestant army broke into Collins territory, they encountered Peyton and Webster, who were waiting at their expected route. The battle began. Chapter 741 Annihilation. Andrew was quite surprised when the vanguard of the Horn Bay army hastily withdrew. For some time now, the Protestant army's advance had been unstoppable. Without the protection of the Guardians, towns along the way dared not hinder their advance. In the tent, the vanguard commander recounted his ordeal with lingering fear. They were a terrifying army. Their formations were impeccably ordered, resembling rows of trees planted neatly on the ground from afar. Their soldiers seemed to know no fear. Once the commander gave the order, they charged like a pack of mad dogs, utterly unafraid of our arrows and forest of bayonets. Their fighting power was incredibly strong, like tireless machines from a fantasy novel. Although our soldiers were also brave, we ultimately couldn't hold out and were defeated. Andrew poured a glass of wine and handed it to the ashamed soldier. You and your troops did your best. Go and rest. The officer saluted him, lifted the tent flap, and went out. Gentlemen, it seems we've encountered a formidable opponent, Andrew said, looking at everyone present. It's Giles' army, the undead army, Mariana said in a deep voice. Gales, Andrew became wary. He knew he had been sent to Horn Bay to eliminate the threat posed by the church's army to Lion Harbor, and the initial reason was that Giles, allied with the Horn Bay church, had sent men to attack Lion Harbor. He asked, You seem to know something about this army. Yes, General. Mariana explained the army's origins to him. Gales obtained a magical potion from spellcasters that could make his soldiers as strong as steel, multiplying their strength. As the head of the Horn Bay land military operations, Andrew had been told in the Northwest Bay what kind of people he would be fighting alongside. A group that disrespected the church, a group that protected magic, especially Eton, the first country on the continent to openly declare wizards as a legal status. Under Eton's leadership, other countries in the Protestant Alliance also successively declared that wizards and ordinary people enjoyed the same rights and status. The war at Horn Bay had a profound impact on the world. Shortly before its outbreak, wizards existed only in urban legends and folklore, but as the war progressed, they had infiltrated the real world, becoming a semi-public presence in many places. When Paul Gleman probed about personnel appointments at Horn Bay, Andrew and Quake showed a surprising tendency. They would prioritize the interests of Alda and the Northwest Bay over their own faith. Of course, it wasn't that others would cower at the prospect of opposing the Holy See, but these two were particularly enthusiastic, so they were sent to Horn Bay, one to command the army and the other the navy. Therefore, when Andrew heard words like spellcaster and magic from Marianne, he wasn't surprised or angry, but merely assessed their potential danger on the battlefield from a military commander's perspective. He questioned Marianne in detail, and only after confirming that Giles's undead army was ultimately just flesh and blood did his anxiety subside. Under Andrew's command, the main force of the Protestant army continued its advance towards Collins, the capital and stronghold of the Horned Church. Finally, they encountered the so-called undead. Giles's army, combined with Webster's, numbered about 30,000, and arrayed themselves in the path the Protestant army would inevitably take. Andrew employed his usual tactic, a cannon barrage followed by an infantry charge. After the artillery barrage, he ordered his troops to attack the enemy phalanx. The undead were indeed formidable. As Webster's army teetered on the brink of collapse from the artillery bombardment, the undead phalanx immediately dispersed to reduce the probability of being killed by artillery fire. However, once the artillery ceased and the Protestant army began its advance, they quickly regrouped and reformed their formation, their efficiency only slightly less than that of the well-trained Arda army. Seeing the Arda army's line approaching, Fernando Peyton, commanding the undead, ordered an attack. Instantly, the undead soldiers, who had been as steadfast as rocks just moments before, took off charging forward, just as the vanguard had described, like a pack of starving rabid dogs released from their cages. Under Andrew's command, the Arda soldiers, forming a line, hastily fired a volley before quickly retreating. Amidst the flames and smoke, the first wave of undead soldiers fell, but the rest showed no fear, continuing their relentless charge towards the Arda army. After a chase, the two armies gradually entered a forest. Bang! With a loud explosion, an undead officer tumbled from his horse to the ground. Bang! Bang! Before anyone could react, more and more sounds like the previous one rang out, taking down more officers. Strangely enough, whenever an officer fell from his horse and died, the undead soldiers around him would behave very strangely. They would either stand motionless, dumbfounded, or become like wild beasts driven only by instinct, even attacking their own comrades. This was the weakness of the undead army that Andrew had learned from Marianne. Although they were powerful in combat, they relied on individual nodes to command them. If their superior nodes suddenly disappeared, they would lose control. So Andrew ordered snipers using rifled guns to set up an ambush in the forest. After luring the undead army into the forest, the snipers hidden in the trees would aim at the officers in command, crippling or killing them with a single shot. The dense jungle environment of Horn Bay provided excellent cover, and Andrew's strategy was executed very well. As the snipers' victories increased, the undead army became increasingly chaotic. The Arda army, which had feigned retreat, surged out of the forest and systematically hunted down the horde of mad beasts. Giles' soldiers, though individually formidable, ultimately became prey to the tightly coordinated attacks and deadly bullets. General Peyton, who commanded them, also perished from a small bullet. He was shouting orders for his troops to retreat to open ground when suddenly his skull flew off, splattering his brains everywhere. Webster's army was unable to provide reinforcements. Faced with the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Protestant forces, he again ordered a retreat, withdrawing directly into the city of Collins. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 742 The Capture of Collins. Collins was plunged into a state of catastrophe, much like Niceburg had been a few months earlier. The fear, despair, and chaos experienced by the people of Niceburg were completely replicated in this inland city. Prices skyrocketed to an unreasonable level, and many items became unavailable no matter how much money one had. The collapse of the market bred violence. Without the control of order, fists were more likely than money to obtain what one wanted. The armed forces that had been maintaining order were either gathered on the city walls for defense or surrounded by various powerful figures for their own security, allowing the chaos among the people to continue to spread. Within the power structure, some hoped to negotiate with the Protestant Union to obtain a more dignified outcome to the war. However, as the seat of the Horn Bay Church, Collins was not short of religious fanatics, especially Archbishop Elvis, who stubbornly hated the Protestant sect he had personally created. He insisted that he was defending the dignity of the Lord of Light on earth and could not live under the same sky as those heretics bewitched by wizards. Either the heretics die, or we are martyred. The blood of the heretics will wash away their sins. In the church, Elvis preached incessantly to the fanatical believers gathered there. His voice, hoarse from days and nights of shouting, was still powerful to others. The archbishop hadn't slept for days. Now, his body was driven entirely by spiritual power, not by his muscles, bones, or the nutrients in his body. Even though Collins was in a state of constant fear, the Corner Bay Church still had a large following in the city. After all, it had been operating there for over a century, deeply entrenched and powerful. When Elvis learned that some in the ruling class were plotting a peace treaty, he immediately rallied his followers to attack the church, find the instigator, and burn him at the stake. This sparked a rebellion among the nobles, nearly igniting a major civil war in Collins. At the critical moment, Papal General Webster and King Garrett III of Collins joined forces to quell the unrest, preventing the city from being destroyed before the enemy could attack. Garrett III was both resolute and hesitant in his resistance against the Protestant army. He had secretly contacted the Protestant Alliance, first proposing that both sides withdraw their troops to their own countries and restore the pre-war order, which was rejected. He then offered Collins reparations, which was also refused. The Protestant Alliance's demands were firm. Garrett III must abdicate, and Collins must be placed under the rule of someone they trusted. But for a king, having his power taken away was more intolerable than having his life taken away. This was the resolute side of Garrett III. But he also harbored another plan, to rely on Collins's formidable defenses to inflict heavy losses on the Protestant Union's attack, forcing them to accept his conditions, at least ensuring he could retain his throne. This was his wavering side. The Protestant army's siege finally began. Dozens of cannons lined up outside the walls, and with the order to fire, their dark muzzles spewed angry flames and deafening roars, slamming heavy shells against the towering walls. The soldiers on the walls huddled behind the battlements, trembling with fear at the tremors beneath their feet. The Collins walls, which they normally considered impregnable, trembled like fearful men under this immense force. The Arda artillery concentrated their fire, relentlessly bombarding a fixed point until the barrels were hot, then cooling, then firing again, in a continuous cycle. Under the bombardment of artillery, the walls of Collins were riddled with stones, bricks constantly shattering and peeling off the walls. The breach, initially inconspicuous, grew larger and larger, eventually becoming visible from a distance. The artillery also maintained a number of smaller cannons. Any attempt by the defenders to repair the walls during lulls in the bombardment was met with deadly casualties. Compared to cumbersome, traditional siege weapons like catapults and ballistae, the well-trained Arda artillery was far superior in terms of flexibility, accuracy, and power. Any attempt to repair the walls was ruthlessly thwarted. The defenders tried repeatedly, only to fail again. Eventually, no one dared risk their lives to repair the ever-widening breach, and they could only watch helplessly as it festered like an infected wound. Finally, after days of repeated bombardment, as the first rays of dawn shone on Collins, with a resounding crash, the section of the Collins city wall that had been under concentrated bombardment completely collapsed. A large number of broken bricks, having lost their last remaining support, slid down to the base of the wall like dumped garbage. Woo! The horn of the final assault sounded. The Protestant soldiers, who had been waiting in ambush, roared in unison, brandishing various weapons and charging bravely towards the breach. They had been promised a huge reward for those who entered the city first, a reward that, for many of them of humble or even lowly birth, could change their lives forever. Everyone fought with all their might. The Collins defenders appeared at the breach in the wall, attempting to stop the invaders, but they were quickly overwhelmed by a flurry of swords and spears. The Protestant soldiers charged forward, treading over the rubble, the flow of people like a flood bursting its banks, surging through the gap in the dam. The Arda army did not participate in the struggle for this honor. Under Andrew's orders, they marched in formation through the city gates captured by their allies. The defenders lost their will to resist the moment the city fell, surrendering en masse. However, the Church of Hornby refused to give up. The church's knights led their fanatical followers out of the streets and alleys, attempting to take the attackers down with them. But after all, they were just civilians not long ago and were no match for the Protestant army that had fought their way through the city. The church's street resistance was mercilessly crushed. The various Protestant armies advanced along different routes to the city center, where the Hornby Cathedral was located. Just as they were about to launch their final assault, a raging fire quickly engulfed the magnificent building. The fire spread so rapidly that it was clear that someone had deliberately set it on fire. "The Father will punish you." Archbishop Elvis appeared on the bell tower. He shouted these words with his last strength before being consumed by the flames. The Hornby War was over. Chapter 743. As the most powerful city-state in the Protestant army and the headquarters of the Hornby Church, the fall of Collins was undoubtedly significant. Even though there were still smaller city-states loyal to the Hornby Church in the interior of Hornby, without Collins and the Church, their influence was negligible. Even if the Protestant army wanted to continue the war until the last country dared to resist, it would be a waste of time. The long campaign had been arduous for everyone. Now they only needed to sit in the city, using it as a time to regroup their troops, and wait for the envoys from those smaller countries to arrive and negotiate surrender terms, unless another dared to cause trouble, in which case a thunderous blow would surely follow. The Protestant army occupied Collins, and at General Andrew's suggestion, they held a grand military parade in this largest city in the Hornby interior. In the city center, in front of the cathedral reduced to ruins, a high reviewing stand was erected. The high-ranking officials of the Protestant Alliance ascended the stand, proudly watching the ranks of soldiers march past below. The Arda army's march was particularly impressive. Soldiers, carrying muskets and swinging their right arms, approached the reviewing stand in perfect unison. Upon reaching the foot of the stand, at the command of salute, all the soldiers turned their gazes in unison, startling the onlookers, who were then awestruck by the army's imposing presence. No one had witnessed the Arda army undergoing any special training for parades beforehand. Their flawless performance suggested they were trained rigorously in this way, a fact that left everyone speechless. The locals of Collins were not forbidden from approaching the parade grounds. In fact, the parade was intended to intimidate them. Nevertheless, most citizens remained afraid to venture out, and even the few bolder ones dared not get too close, huddled cautiously in the shadows of alleyways, watching the conquerors strut arrogantly through the city square in front of the church. Meanwhile, punishment for those who initiated the war was underway. After years of war, the Protestant Union had compiled a thick blacklist. Almost all the high-ranking members of the Hornby Church were arrested. Within the Collins nobility, the hardliners were also arrested, and other nobles were confined to their homes, strictly forbidden from leaving. However, this confinement wasn't for leisure, it was to allow them to assess their wealth. The Protestant Union prepared a substantial fine for each member of the Collins ruling class. It should be noted that these fines were only for individuals. Collins, as a nation, also had to pay an exorbitant reparations, as did the Hornby Church. Before the religious division in Hornby, each nation contributed tithes to the church, demonstrating the immense wealth it had accumulated. Collins, as the church's headquarters, also received a significant share. In fact, after the city fell, the church and royal treasuries were almost immediately looted, and soldiers from different nations within the Allied forces nearly came to blows over gold coins. Fortunately, the Alda army's cannons were promptly dragged into the city. When the dark muzzles of the cannons were pointed at the chaotic army, everyone quickly regained their composure and became more agreeable. After all, no one wanted to test whether their body was tougher than the walls of Collins. Andrew ordered the treasury sealed and emphasized that the distribution of spoils would be decided jointly by the high-ranking officials of each faction within the Protestant army. Lister traveled by carriage, bumping along the way from Lyon Harbor to Collins. As he entered the city, Lister couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion. Years ago, when he was just a lowly merchant clerk, he had come to this largest city in the Hornby inland for work. Back then, to close a deal, he had endured countless scornful glances from arrogant nobles and the behaving of those in power. Now, he had returned, arriving as a conqueror. He wondered what expressions those once arrogant nobles would have when they saw him. Lord Lister, just as his carriage was about to enter the palace, a somewhat hoarse voice rang out from the side. Lister turned and recognized the man, Earl Bridges, a nobleman from Collins. It was Earl Bridges who introduced him to the noble class of Collins, and at the banquet he met the astronomer, or rather, the astrologer, Cable. However, the Earl was no longer the man of his former glory. His once silk robes were now clad in tattered commoner's clothes, his face smeared with black grime, making him look like an old farmer selling vegetables. "Thank goodness you've finally arrived," Bridges' voice choked with emotion before he could finish speaking. "Your Excellency, what happened to you?" Lister asked in surprise. "To find you. You don't know, if I had gone out in my usual clothes, I probably would have been stripped naked long ago." Bridges burst into tears. Lister led Bridges into the palace and ordered a reception room to be found for his meeting with Bridges. Lord Lister, the moment the door to the reception room was closed by the servant, Bridges knelt before him, pleading with Lord Lister to spare Collins. "Their demands are too high, many families cannot afford such a sum, and once the deadline passes, those people will be thrown into prison. I know you are Marcus Gleman's representative in Horn Bay, and his army was a key factor in saving the Protestant Union. I believe your words carry weight. Please save the nobles in Collins." Lister, sitting on the sofa, constantly stroking his chin with his right hand, patiently listened to Bridges' rambling explanation. Finally, he stepped forward and patted the Earl on the shoulder. "Your Excellency, first I must clarify one point. Arda can forego his due share." Bridges' eyes widened, almost unable to believe his ears. "If Collins is willing to pledge allegiance to Marcus Gleman," Lister continued. Bridges grew displeased. "Does the Marcus intend to annex us?" No. Just to become a protectorate. Your Majesty, the future king of Collins." "Even so." "Wait, what did you say?" Lister laughed heartily at him. "Would you be willing to become the new king of Collins?" Bridges' heart pounded. Chapter 744 Post-War Arrangements. In fact, after the outcome of the Battle of Hestia, discussions about post-war arrangements began. Envoys from various Protestant nations frequently exchanged visits, presenting their demands and eagerly seeking their own interests. For Port Lion, its initial purpose in joining the war was to protect its land, property, and the lives of its citizens in Cape Bay. Its primary demand was that no forces in Cape Bay should be hostile to Port Lion. Undoubtedly, installing a friendly ruler in Collins, the strongest inland nation, was an effective method. Port Lion single-handedly changed the course of the war. When the Protestant alliance was on the verge of defeat, Port Lion joined, quickly reversing the tide of victory. It can be said that without Port Lion, there would have been no victory. The coastal nations of Cape Bay would have been ravaged by the Cape Bay Church and its protectors. The fighting prowess displayed by the Cape Bay Volunteers, and the wealth that supported it, impressed the other nations. In truth, for the people of Cape Bay, whose livelihood depended on maritime trade, no one at this time would consider the Northwest Bay to be impoverished in terms of wealth. For various reasons, everyone respected Lionport's interests and unanimously agreed that the future ruler of Collins should be chosen by Lionport. Of course, everyone knew this essentially meant following the arrangements of Lake Town behind Lionport. For the Horn Bay Alliance, besides a large indemnity, they also wanted to move the Horn Bay Church's headquarters to Newsburg, with a new Horn Bay Archbishop to be decided by the Alliance. The Horn Bay Alliance's demands caused some dissatisfaction, especially regarding the choice of the Horn Bay Archbishop. Everyone knew this was a powerful tool for controlling thought. If Newsburg were allowed to appoint him, wouldn't everyone in Horn Bay have to follow the Alliance's lead? If the Horn Bay Alliance had withstood the attack of the Papacy's army and pushed back, given its status as the strongest nation in the Protestant Alliance, it wouldn't have been difficult for other countries to accept its demands. However, the Horn Bay Alliance was nearly destroyed by the Papacy's army in the war, only recovering its territory thanks to Lionport's rescue. Based on the Alliance's poor performance in the war, many countries felt resentful and disagreed with its demands. Just as the argument was raging, Mayor Lister of Lionport quickly intervened to mediate. After some effort, all parties compromised and reached a new agreement. The headquarters of the Horn Bay Church would remain in Newsburg, but the selection of the Archbishop of Horn Bay would be decided by a vote of senior clergy from each country, and the heads of each diocese would be appointed and dismissed by their respective countries. Furthermore, the new Horn Bay Church would abolish tithes, and everyone could contribute funds to support the church's operations, but the use of these funds must be transparent and subject to scrutiny by each contributor. Another important nation in the Protestant alliance was the Duchy of Eton. Duke Cabrera's demands were somewhat romantic. He only wanted a small sum of reparations to compensate the fallen soldiers, enough to cover their needs, but he hoped that all Hornbay nations would recognize the existence of spellcasters and guarantee them the same rights as ordinary people. Everyone was delighted to hear that someone was willing to accept a smaller share of the war money, and they agreed to Grand Duke Colbray's arrangements regarding the spellcasters. In fact, over 90% of the Protestant alliance had already recognized that spellcasters enjoyed the same rights as ordinary people. The next step was to get the landlocked states to accept it. Fortunately, they were the defeated side, so they had no choice but to acknowledge it. As for the other countries, they were mostly small city-states with very practical demands, to get as much money as possible from the reparations. Once Lister entered Collins and presented the generals with a post-war treaty unanimously signed by the representatives of all the countries, he could act as he pleased. Lister's purpose was to select a new king of Collins, and he had done extensive work for this, studying the history of Collins in detail and gathering information on all the secular figures in power he could find. After much deliberation, Lister finally chose Earl Bridges, the man who had hosted him long ago. When Lister was still a merchant, he realized that Earl Bridges was not a man of strong principles. This Earl could talk to him easily, and for the sake of practical interests, he could avoid discussing differences in religious ideology. Most importantly, Earl Bridges and Lister had a good personal relationship. He decided that Earl Bridges was the one. With the support of Port Lyon, Bridges officially ascended the throne of Collins, and more than 40,000 Protestant soldiers stationed in the city endorsed His Majesty the King. When this news reached the prison, the imprisoned former King Garrett III of Collins was almost driven mad. When Collins fell, he had tried to escape in disguise, but unfortunately, he was discovered. The king's identity still held considerable power over soldiers in that era. Garrett III, one of the most important initiators of the Horn of Cove War, was not mistreated, but merely imprisoned, awaiting the judgment of the Protestant High Command. He pounded on the door, demanding to see Lister, shouting that he could give Bridges anything, so why shouldn't he be allowed to continue ruling his country? Whenever Garrett III pounded on the door, Webster, who was also imprisoned nearby, would mock him mercilessly. "What wishful thinking, you're already a useless piece of trash. What do those heretics do to useless people?" Webster had been organizing defenses on the city walls, but unfortunately, the artillery of the Arda army rendered any defensive techniques he had learned from history useless. When the walls were breached by that savage force, even Webster was powerless to reverse the situation. He wanted to kill himself, but his subordinates stopped him. While they were arguing, Protestant soldiers rushed in, and Webster was taken prisoner. Webster's fate was decided. He would lead a group of prisoners from the papacy's reinforcements back to the Holy City. Considering the papacy's still considerable power, this was also a way to curry favor with them. Not long after, Webster and his men were released and sailed back to papacy headquarters in the galleys they had brought. The papacy was delighted by the return of this force, as they were planning a new war. Webster and his men possessed extensive combat experience and could play a crucial role in the upcoming conflict. This new war was the War of Punishment against the Gabella Empire. Chapter 745. The Alder Court, also closely monitoring the situation at Horn Bay, soon received news of the war's end. This sparked considerable discussion within Crystal Radiance. King Rodney's VIE carefully read the intelligence reports from each battle. The performance of the 5,000 Alder soldiers and the 20,000 Horn Bay mercenaries trained under the Alda system on the Hestia battlefield was truly astonishing. In particular, the 20,000 Horn Bay mercenaries were able to adjust their formation promptly and accurately after the collapse of their right-wing allies, blocking threats from the flank. Rodney's VIE believed that his new army, trained by Alda instructors, would be no less capable than the Horn Bay mercenaries, especially since his soldiers and Alda soldiers shared the same blood as the Alder. This further solidified the king's confidence in training a new army. Undoubtedly, the battle at Horn Bay was a powerful blow to those old-fashioned figures who opposed his military reforms. The Alda army had once again proven their combat prowess in real battle. What reason was there not to emulate a victor? However, the comments regarding the Arda army, or rather, their lord Paul Gleman, were not all praiseworthy. Many criticized his involvement in the Horn Bay War, even though it was done under the guise of a civilian group from Lyonport. Although he is a sword-wielding lord, it is utterly disrespectful to wage war against other foreign powers without the kingdom's consent. Does he even respect His Majesty the King? Someone should be sent to the Northwest Bay to reprimand Gleman. Those who already harbored resentment towards Paul Gleman expressed their dissatisfaction, with some even believing that this most powerful lord in the northwest of the kingdom had degenerated into a traitor like Giles and Veblen. But defending one's territory and property from invasion is the inherent right of a frontier lord. Indeed, Collins invaded first, and Gleman's exercise of power was entirely legitimate. The kingdom has an obligation to help its vassals. Should we be pleased that a lord has dealt with the enemy himself without troubling the royal family? There were also many who spoke in Paul's defense. Ultimately, Rodney's vie quelled the controversy. Paul Gleman's exercise of his rights as a sword-wielding noble was legitimate. In the king's statement to the crowd, Marcus Gleman remained loyal to the kingdom, evidenced by his army's use of the name Horn Bay Volunteers rather than other official designations. Even more significant evidence was that Paul Gleman had escorted the captured soldiers of Giles's forces from the Horn Bay War to Crystal Radiance for the kingdom's government to handle, demonstrating that in Paul Gleman's eyes, the king remained the supreme arbiter of Alder. Besides all this, the Horn Bay War, due to its large following, showcased new weapons from the Northwest Bay, such as muskets and cannons. These weapons, capable of almost bridging the physical and strength disparities between the two sides, aroused considerable curiosity. This naturally included Rodney's vie. These firearms had repeatedly proven their value, and His Majesty the King had long coveted the Northwest Bay's weaponry. The relationship between the royal family and Paul Gleman was poised to deepen further. If the Battle of Horn Bay brought confidence and anticipation to the Ualdo court, it was nothing short of terror to Giles of Five Rams City. The powerful undead army was Giles's reliance. He had used it to quell the rebellious Southerners and withstand the royal army's southward campaign. Unwavering loyalty, unyielding obedience, and fearlessness in the face of casualties, commanding such an army had once filled him with immense pride. Previously, the Mystic Guild's restrictions on the medicines they provided limited the undead army to 6,000 men. Now, Giles had secretly recruited spellcasters at great expense, and through painstaking research, had finally discovered some elements of the Mystic Guild's medicines, creating substitutes. Although the effects were somewhat inferior to the originals, they were still enough to satisfy Giles. Thus, the undead army's size exceeded 6,000, and with the abundant supply of generic drugs, this powerful army had finally reached 10,000. However, the events of the Battle of Horn Bay shattered the pride in the heart of the Grand Duke of Greed. The initial night raid on Lionport failed, but Giles attributed it to being outnumbered and the Collins outside the city not coordinating in time. However, once Lionport officially entered the battle, his undead army proved utterly ineffective against the Arda army's muskets and cannons. Peyton, knowing beforehand the penetrating power of Arda firearms, had equipped his soldiers with thick armor, but it proved useless in the heat of battle. The armor offered no protection against the incoming projectiles. Faced with this terrifying firepower, the undead soldiers, trained with expensive drugs, were slaughtered one by the Arda army's firearms, just like the auxiliary cannon fodder. Even Giles's beloved general, Peyton, perished in the Arda army's firepower. Upon receiving news of his army's defeat, Giles's former arrogance vanished overnight, replaced by deep anxiety. What unsettled him even more was that the Ualdo court was hiring officers from the Arda army to train its own troops. While it might be far from the Northwest Bay, it was close to the royal domain. Rodney's vie's massive military training was likely not only aimed at the orcs, but also at Giles himself. He had to act immediately. He couldn't just sit and wait to die. Giles thought of the Arcane Council again. The ripples caused by the Horn Bay War in the outside world hadn't affected Paul Giles. Before officially dispatching troops, Cecil's intelligence department had already thoroughly investigated the situation in Horn Bay. Human geography, customs, food, and various flora and fauna were compiled into a book, distributed to officers and soldiers for reading and reference, just as they had done during the York invasion. To prepare for potential war, Lionport stockpiled combat-related supplies such as food, gunpowder, ammunition, uniforms, and boots, and allocated a large number of manpower to maintain various transportation lines. These meticulous preparatory tasks ensured the smooth progress of the subsequent battles. Paul had absolute confidence in his well-prepared army. While he was naturally delighted upon receiving news of their victory, he didn't experience any dramatic emotional fluctuations. After instructing the relevant departments to properly handle the soldiers' compensation and rewards, he devoted himself to preparations for his wedding with Catherine. Alda was finally about to welcome its mistress. Chapter 746. Beneath the distant horizon, a vast expanse of green stretches out, like an endless green tapestry gently draped over the earth's bosom. Sunlight pours down from the azure dome, its golden rays shimmering and sparkling with the dewdrops on the grass, each ray seemingly telling a story. This is the Great Plains, the dwelling place of the orcs. Countless orc tribes follow their millennia-old nomadic traditions, herding horses and sheep across the grasslands, living by the water and pasture. This seemingly endless grassland is actually divided into northern and southern parts, separated by a vast Gobi Desert. Human caravans, or armies, coming from the south of the Rocky Mountains mostly access the southern grasslands. Historically, no one has ever crossed the Gobi to reach the northern grasslands. This Gobi Desert, which bisects the vast grasslands, can be considered a desolate wasteland. Only elderly shamans among the orcs know the safe routes across it. For this reason, throughout history, this desert, considered a dead end, has saved the orcs from the brink of extinction on several occasions. Although the grasslands are vast, their carrying capacity is very low. A severe drought or a heavy snowfall can kill large numbers of livestock. Deprived of their means of survival, the orcs then turn their attention to the human territories to the south. Human territories are fertile lands with developed agriculture and abundant produce. In the orcs' eyes, they are practically flowing with milk and honey. So they ride in groups to human territories to plunder grain, cloth, and other essential supplies, using their speed advantage to escape quickly before human armed forces can react. Specifically, within the Kingdom of Alder, the Loki Mountains, stretching east to west across its northern border, offer relative safety as long as the Gabella corridor leading to the Great Plains in the northeast is secure. This relative safety stems from the fact that the dwarven clans of the Loki Mountains, fearing the increasing proximity of human settlements to their territory, periodically open secret passages through the mountains to allow small groups of orcs to pass, using the orcs to drive out the humans. Human civilization rises and falls. During periods of decline, they can only swallow their brunt of orc raids, but during periods of prosperity, they send powerful armies to conquer orc tribes on the plains. Human armies overwhelmingly surpass orcs in organization, weaponry, and supplies. The orcs' only advantage is greater strength, but this cannot negate the many other advantages humans possess, resulting in more defeats than victories against human armies. When the orcs were utterly defeated, to escape the human army determined to annihilate them, they were forced to enter the Gobi Desert. Led by wise old shamans, they traversed the desert and settled in the northern grasslands to recuperate. Pursuing the orcs deep into the grasslands was already difficult for human armies, let alone crossing the Gobi Desert. Therefore, each time the orcs entered the Gobi, the humans could only sigh in despair and retreat south. The surviving orcs would recuperate in the northern grasslands, and once their strength grew, they would cross the Gobi again, reclaim the southern grasslands, and begin the cycle once more. Until Abar's king's tent appeared, the situation changed slightly. We're almost there. Their tribal settlement is just ahead. An excited shout abruptly ended Arvis's memories of the grassland history. Alvis, perched atop his camel, gazed into the distance and saw scattered tents across the grassland ahead, among which were many figures, presumably the inhabitants of this tribe. Behind those tents, the mountain that had stood silently stretching across the distant horizon remained. He had thought that after so many days of travel, he would surely have reached the edge of the mountain range, but it seemed far from that point. There's a saying, looking at a mountain makes a horse run itself to death, and it seemed true indeed. Looks like we can rest for a while. His guard, Marek, rode a camel beside him. To escape the witch's pursuit, the master and servant hadn't taken the Narradan corridor, but instead headed directly north into the grasslands. They were fortunate enough to encounter a human caravan, supposedly heading to the grasslands for trade. Alvis and Marek joined the caravan, hoping to gather more information. Ahead, the caravan leader had already met with an orc riding up on horseback. The leader pulled out a long sheet of paper and began reading aloud. It was filled with everyday goods for exchange. 2 slaves. This will cost extra. The chieftain handed the list to the orc who had come to make contact. Alvis understood immediately and became alert. Slaves? After these past few days of interaction, he knew this caravan hadn't brought any slaves. Clang, the sound of a sword being drawn shattered the silence. It was Malik. He understood the implication. The caravan was going to sell him and Alvis to the orcs. The caravan's guards noticed his intention, and 2 immediately pounced on him. One blocked Malek's sword, while the other attacked from the side. Malek, preoccupied with the guards, was quickly pinned to the ground, and Alvis was also captured. Thus, they both became prisoners of the caravan, or rather, gifts exchanged with the orc tribe. The two were forced apart. Alvis was taken to a tent. The tent, constructed from thick animal hides and sturdy branches, stood quietly on the grass, like a small haven in nature. The setting sun filtered through the sparse leaves, dappling the tent flaps and bathing this small haven in a warm golden light. Alvis lifted the tent flap and entered. There sat an elderly orc on a low stool carved from rough logs. His face was weathered, each wrinkle a testament to the passage of time and wisdom. He had long, slightly drooping ears covered with a thin layer of down, a unique mark of his race. Though his hair was gray, his eyes remained clear and deep, radiating peace and resilience. The old orc turned his eyes. Beneath his eyelids lay a cloud of cloudiness, but when he looked at Alvis, an indescribable light shone from them. A scholar from the White Tower of Gabella, he asked in a hoarse voice. Alvis was stunned. How did this old orc know? From his clothes to his accent, he had concealed everything that might reveal his identity. And you are? Alvis asked in return. I am the shaman here, scholar, the old orc stated, revealing his identity. Chapter 747. As a scholar of the Gabella Scholar's Tower, Alvis knew what shamans were among the orcs. The orcs on the plains generally worshipped the spirits of the plains, and shamans were the group responsible for communicating between mortals and these spirits. However, their work went beyond that. They were also responsible for passing on clan knowledge, or rather, educating the next generation. However, what shocked him even more was the old orc's next words, and I also know that your name is Alvis. This left Alvis utterly bewildered, speechless for a moment. The old orc explained, many years ago, I traveled to Gabella with a caravan and heard your speech beneath the towering White Tower. I must say, it was an unforgettable experience. I see. What a small world, Alvis remarked, a wave of sadness washing over him as he thought of his current predicament. I never imagined that many years later, I would also come to your land with a caravan, only to become a prisoner. He was pessimistic about his fate. After all, in the common perception of humans, orcs were cruel and tyrannical beings, and these barbaric and uncivilized creatures probably didn't know how to respect knowledge or its holders. The old orc grinned, revealing his large fangs. Master Yarvis, wise man among humans, why are you so sad? Please allow me to introduce myself. Our name is Orcish. Oh, Orcish. Yarvis's eyes widened, his long eyebrows trembling. Chieftain Abar and the royal tent hadn't risen to power overnight. The southern Gabella Empire was certainly not unaware of the long-standing events on the Great Plains, especially since the two sides had just fought a war. As one of the Gabella Empire's higher-ranking officials, Yarvis knew many important figures on the plains besides Abar. Much of the intelligence came from MacDonald, the marshal who took the orcs' rise very seriously. Among the many Orcish intelligence Yarvis knew was Orcish, said to be an extremely important figure by Abar's side. As the fearsome orc chieftain, Abar's upbringing was quite arduous. He lost his father's love in his childhood, and Orcish took on the responsibility of raising him, carefully guiding and teaching him. Due to his unique upbringing, Abar developed a patient and reserved character, secretly cultivating his own power, while Orcish consistently stood by his side, quietly providing assistance. The previous great chieftain of the royal tent died somewhat suddenly, without having time to arrange his successor. As the eldest son, Abar should have been the rightful successor, but his long-standing lack of his father's favor led to considerable controversy, especially among his resentful brothers, who united in rebellion. Their forces were numerous, far surpassing Abar's combined strength, undoubtedly placing him in a dangerous situation. At this critical moment, Orcish firmly stood by Abar's side. Now the highest-ranking shaman in the royal tent, his stance significantly reversed Abar's disadvantage. After a series of brutal civil wars, Abar emerged victorious, becoming the undisputed great chieftain of the steppe royal tent, while Orcish, as his longtime supporter, became second only to Abar in rank within the tribe. Forgive my rudeness, Lord Orcish. Yarvi placed one hand on his chest and bowed slightly to the figure before him, a figure equivalent to prime minister in a human nation. He did not question whether Orcish was an impostor. As almost no orc dared to disrespect a shaman responsible for communicating with the gods. Yarvi inquired, so, this is, you mean the royal tent? Orcish smiled and continued, no, The royal tent is where the great chieftain is. This is just an ordinary orc settlement. And our great chieftain is still in Alder. Thank you for your correction. You're welcome, Master Yarvi. Adashi smiled. As far as I know, you escaped from the Gabella Empire, although the Empire's high command had not publicized Yarvi's departure, nor had they openly launched a manhunt. As the second in command of the Scholar's Tower and an important member of the Empire's high command, Yarvi's sudden disappearance could not be concealed, and it had probably already spread in some small circles. Faced with the old orc's revelation, Arvis was taken aback. How did the orcs, thousands of miles away, know about his escape? It seemed the orcs had spies within the Empire. Yes, I have some disagreements with the current Emperor on political matters, Arvis admitted helplessly. Let me guess. Odyssey narrowed his eyes, his thick fingers tapping on the table. You were probably chased all the way here, otherwise you wouldn't have fled to our grasslands in such a panic. Yes, Arvis admitted. The Emperor sent assassins, and I was in constant danger. How? Odyssey chuckled. That means you have some connection to our grasslands, and so, guided by the spirit of the grasslands, though in a rather unusual way, you were brought here. He looked at Arvis, stroking his white beard carefully, and after a few minutes, he spoke. Arvis, perhaps we can make a deal. A deal? Yes, a deal, the old shaman nodded. The royal tent will protect your safety, and you, in turn, must pledge allegiance to the royal tent, to Chieftain Abar. Arvis almost doubted whether he had heard correctly. He pointed to himself. Me, a human, pledging allegiance to the chieftain of the orcs. Yes, Odyssey confirmed. Yalvis, your knowledge, your intelligence, are exactly what these orcs, who are trying to break free from barbarity, need. Our society is indeed primitive, and I am not ashamed to admit it. The old orc looked at Yalvis with sincere eyes. For a moment, the scholar's heart fluttered slightly, but he still shook his head. I'm sorry, I can't help you. Yalvis refused Odyssey outright. My intelligence is too shallow to support me in serving Chieftain Abar. Please let me face the storm alone. How? Odyssey wasn't angry. Instead, he said, I hope you stay here for at least 3 years in exchange for your freedom. He deliberately emphasized the word freedom in his words, and Yalvis then remembered that he was still the other man's slave. Chapter 748. Arvis was born into a noble family in Gabella. He entered the Imperial Academy in his youth and rose through the ranks thanks to his talent and knowledge, eventually becoming second only to his senior, Aldrich, and a crucial strategist in the Gabella court. Being abducted by an unscrupulous caravan and sold into slavery in an orc tribe was an unbearable humiliation for Arvis. Adding to this, he had already broken with the rulers of Gabella, making it impossible for them to send anyone to ransom him. Moreover, if Gabella knew he was there, they were more likely to send assassins than messengers. Arvis spent a short time slowly savoring the boiling sense of shame in his chest. Such intense emotional turmoil was rare for someone his age and experience. Very well. Respected Shaman Odyssey, I agree to your conditions. I am willing to serve Kanabar for 3 years in exchange for my freedom, but I require a certain degree of freedom, of course. Respected scholar, Odyssey seemed somewhat surprised, but this quickly turned to delight. A renowned and truly talented member of the Scholar's Tower was a windfall for the royal tent. Arvis requested, and my guard, Marek, also needs the same freedom as me, of course. That's reasonable, Odyssey nodded. And so, Arvis remained among the orcs, appointed as his advisor by Shaman Odyssey. Clearly, Odyssey wasn't keeping Arvis by his side for nothing. Arvis was soon given the task of compiling the legal texts of the Gabella Empire. We planned to refer to the legal codes of various countries on the continent to create a code suitable for the orcs, Arvis learned from Odyssey with astonishment. These nomadic tribes of the steppes, who not long ago lacked even a written language and ruled entirely by force, were now creating their own laws. And soon, Alvis discovered that his previous belief that orcs had no writing system was incorrect. Odyssey showed him their script. Although still rudimentary and crude, Alvis saw in them a solid framework, one that, given time, would develop into something as sophisticated as human writing. Moreover, one astonishing event after another followed. Over time, Alvis discovered that the orcs were indeed imitating humans, establishing a bureaucratic system with ministers of finance, civil administration, foreign affairs, and other officials responsible for specific tasks, along with their various subordinates. He had heard about this from Marshal MacDonald, but witnessing it firsthand still seemed unbelievable. Alvis sensed immense danger. The orcs of the past were merely a disorganized mob, even with their formidable fighting prowess and swift horsemanship. Without a system to unite them, they could never pose a significant threat to the human world. But now they had one, the Royal Tent, a force that could truly unite the orcs. Besides surprise, Arvis felt a pang of unease. He realized he wasn't the only human serving the High Chieftain. The Royal Tent's bureaucracy contained a large number of other humans. We welcome all those who aspire to realize their value. Here, they can always find a suitable place, Odyssey said to Arvis with undisguised pride. Impoverished nobles, second sons without inheritance rights, frustrated bureaucrats, even desperate prisoners, in your eyes, they may be the rejects of society, but to us, they are simply not placed in the right place. Once placed correctly, these people can unleash tremendous energy. The old shaman's words made Arvis wary. This was how orcs continuously drew sustenance from the human world to grow stronger. And so, Arvis was bound to the orc tribe, while Malak was released and returned to Arvis's side, continuing to serve as his guard. Arvis and Malak enjoyed a degree of freedom, able to move freely between tents, talk to anyone, learn anything, and teach anything, as naturally as if they were one of the orcs. Arvis even wore a shamanic ornament given to him by Odyssey, an ornament that held immense power over ordinary orcs, who would look at him with reverence. However, whenever Arvis attempted to leave the tribe, or even stray slightly, an orc would immediately catch up on horseback and persuade him to return. Clearly, Odyssey had men watching Arvis, and only then would he remember his status as a slave, and that long-forgotten sense of shame would resurface. Finally, on a foggy morning, Arvis and his servant Malak disappeared into the thick morning mist, 6 months after their capture. In truth, the two had been searching for an opportunity, an escape that would allow them to safely break away from the orc tribe. This was no easy feat. Even with their exceptional horsemanship, Arvis and Malak wouldn't be able to shake off the orcs' pursuit once they were on horseback, even at night. Unlike many humans who struggle to see at night, orcs possessed remarkably sharp eyesight, even under darkness. Unless a specific environment could completely obscure the orc pursuer's vision, a dense fog would suffice. The night before the fog was to descend, Arvis, with his meteorological experience, sensed its approach. The knowledge of the top scholars in the Scholars' Tower finally came in handy. Arvis quietly informed Malak to prepare. Heaven did not disappoint them. Before sunrise, the fog Arvis had been hoping for arrived as predicted, obscuring the grasslands of the tribe's settlement, reducing visibility to a mere fraction even for those with excellent eyesight. To Alvis, the sudden fog seemed tailor-made for his and Marek's predicament. Having not slept all night, they immediately sprang into action, mounting the prepared horses and dashing into the fog without looking back. No one pursued them, perhaps no one noticed their escape, or perhaps the pursuers lost sight of them in the fog. Guided by Marek's astonishing sense of direction, Alvis and Marek frantically cracked their whips, urging their mounts to gallop westward at breakneck speed. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 749. Catherine Rodney finally arrived in Arda. The princess and her entourage had come by ship, landing at Port Fland. Everything here filled Catherine with wonder. The impression of the Northwest Bay among the Crystal Radiance nobility had changed several times. At first, many had never even heard of the place. Later, it must be some poor, remote place on the outskirts of the kingdom, right? Then, as goods from the Northwest Bay became increasingly prevalent, and items such as paper, porcelain, and thermos flasks filled the lives of the nobles, the Northwest Bay in their minds transformed into a vast factory. But what now appeared before Catherine at Port Fland was a well-organized city, with wide streets, a clean cityscape, well-arranged buildings, and a bustling crowd, in no way inferior to the royal capital, Crystal Radiance. No, it was even more so, because the dazzling, clean and prosperous areas were limited to the upper city where the nobles lived. Once outside the upper city, the narrow alleys, low houses, and muddy roads immediately revealed the stark contrast between the city's two sides. But under Eileen Rodney's guidance, Catherine explored many parts of the city. The city's overall style was unified, unlike the vast differences between different parts of the capital. Catherine brought her mother, Phyllis, and younger sister, Eileen, with her to Northwest Bay. For the little Princess Eileen, It was a return to familiar territory. During her time away from home in Northwest Bay, she had visited Port Franklin countless times, and even oversaw the construction of a school there. Back then, she had been appointed by Paul to manage education. Yet, even so, the city's development had exceeded Eileen's expectations. It had expanded significantly, and many old areas had changed completely, even though she had only been away for a few years. It seems Sir Smollett didn't waste his time. Paul must have paid him a hefty sum, the little princess guessed. Based on his memories from his previous life, Paul Gleman proposed numerous functional zones for the city and some possible elements for the future. This urban planning master was amazed by Lord Gleman's boundless imagination. Many of his ideas seemed more suited to fantasy novels, such as trains running on tracks, sewers large enough for adults to pass through, and massive steel bridges spanning rivers. Even regarding the city's scale, Paul Gleman had him design plans for the city at various stages of development, aiming for a population of 1 million. However, adhering to professional ethics and prioritizing his clients, Sir Smollett visited each city under the administration of the government, finally adapting Paul's fantasy to local conditions in his designs. The municipal departments throughout Arda strictly follow their respective plans to develop and construct their cities, largely avoiding haphazard construction during the influx of people and rapid industrial development. This is why Catherine and Eileen can see the current state of Flanders. "Ah, we've arrived safely, that's wonderful." Phyllis patted her chest, seemingly very relieved. This pampered queen had never experienced sailing at sea before, and the feeling of having her feet firmly on the ground again brought her a great sense of relief. At Paul's behest, Hansel, who was waiting at Port Franklin, greeted the two princesses and the former Queen Phyllis, and arranged for a caravan to take them to Lake Town the following day. This northward journey of the royal family wasn't limited to the two princesses and the former queen. It also included a large number of generals from the old royal army, including Offena, Klein, Leicester, and Dempsey. King Rodney's VA had assigned them the task of serving in the Arda army and learning from their advanced experience. "What are they doing?" Through the carriage window, Eileen pointed to a construction site in the distance. The workers seemed to be laying foundations, but it didn't look like they were building anything. Hansel, riding beside Eileen's carriage, glanced in that direction when he heard the princess's question. "Your Highness, they must be laying railway tracks." "Railways? Ah, I remember now," Eileen suddenly realized. "I remember now." Paul thought about laying a track between Lake Town and Port Franklin, and then using horses to pull large carriages along the track. It said that this would make the journey much faster. You're half right," Hansel smiled knowingly. "Tell me the answer." Eileen was a little annoyed. "This track isn't for horse-drawn carriages, but rather uses the power of a machine to pull the carriages." The power of a machine? Catherine and Eileen were both curious. "Yes, the power of a machine," Hansel explained, "a powerful machine that fills with coal and burns it fiercely, producing a power that humans cannot match. Not to mention humans, even strong animals like horses and cows cannot match it." Sir Burns called it the steam engine. Burns? That name sounds familiar. A flash of inspiration struck Catherine. "That eccentric tech guy from Crystal Brilliance, he's been working for Paul for years." Eileen's words reminded Catherine of him. Around noon, the caravan arrived at the outskirts of Lakeside Town, where Catherine met her fiancé, Paul Gleman. "Welcome, everyone," he greeted each person warmly, and when he reached Catherine, he mischievously took her hand. Being so flirted by her fiancé in front of everyone, the princess blushed and shyly turned her head away, causing those around her to chuckle. "Congratulations. I heard your army won a battle at Horn Bay." Catherine tried to ease the awkwardness. It was the army hired by the Lion Harbor merchants that won. Strictly speaking, I was just their military contractor." Everyone knows what's going on." Paul invited Catherine to ride with him in a carriage, just the two of them, traveling and talking on land. "I hope you won't be distracted by the situation at Horn Bay. The orcs on the other side are the real enemy, of course. Besides expanding the army, I'm also upgrading my military equipment and facilities. Didn't you see those rails on the way here? That's the experimental railway I built to improve logistical support, the kind of train Hansel mentioned, pulled by coal-fired machines. I call it the train. This will be a revolutionary means of transportation. Perhaps the train is still quite weak now, not much better than a horse-drawn carriage, but with continuous technological iteration, it will eventually develop to a level that no number of horse-drawn carriages can match. "Just you wait," Paul proudly showed off to Catherine, then winked mysteriously. "By the way, would you like to see my cannons? Sorry, this chapter is a bit delayed." Chapter 750 Ironworks. The Lord's Castle on the island in the lake was originally the residence of the Gleman family, but in recent years, the building has increasingly deviated from its original residential function, rapidly transforming into an office space. The main reason is that Paul's territory has expanded significantly, and the economy of his domain has developed extremely rapidly, far surpassing the stagnant feudal economy of traditional territories. Therefore, the number of affairs he has to handle has increased, and since one person's energy is limited, the number of officials assisting him has also grown. Since the establishment of the Council of State, with a continuous subdivision of administrative areas, in addition to the initial 7 departments, finance, agriculture, industry, fisheries, forestry, public security, intelligence, and education, departments such as science and technology, commerce, transportation, maritime affairs, and health have been added. Some large departments have already moved out of the Lord's Mansion and established independent offices on the island, leaving the officials of the remaining smaller departments still appearing numerous even within the Lord's Mansion. Most of the rooms in the Lord's Manor were used as offices for various departments. Paul was reluctant to move them out of his castle unless absolutely necessary, not because he craved power, but because there were no telephones in this era. If he suddenly needed to ask someone about something or discuss something, it would be very inconvenient if the person wasn't around. Furthermore, he needed to meet with people from all walks of life, elected officials, industry leaders, local celebrities, and so on. For all these reasons, all sorts of people came and went from Paul's manor every day. Clearly, it was inappropriate to house Catherine and the others in the manor. Even without the above reasons, it would make them feel like dependents. Therefore, Paul selected a scenic woodland on the western outskirts of Lancashire town and built an exquisite manor there long ago, very close to the main road leading to Port Franklin, making transportation extremely convenient. Now, he gave it to Queen Phyllis, who was about to become his mother-in-law, and it would also serve as a residence for the 2 princesses. Queen Phyllis was very satisfied with and grateful for Paul's arrangements. After visiting the Northwest Bay and seeing its various sights, she grew increasingly fond of her prospective son-in-law. She had initially been somewhat displeased with Rodney's VIE for using her daughter as a tool for political marriage, but now felt her nephew had done a great thing. Although Eileen had grown a few years older, she remained the same lively girl. Years ago, when she ran away from home to Lake Town, she bought a 2-story house on the island as her home. Paul had maintained the house very well over the years, for which she was very grateful. It held memories of a free, joyful, and fulfilling period of her life, and she decided to spend a few days there every month. Many of the Royal Navy officers who arrived in the Northwest Bay with the royal family had already served for many years. It seemed inappropriate to send them to military academy to study for a few more years. After discussing it with Catherine, Paul made the following arrangement: they would all be placed in the training regiment. The training regiment was a newly established demonstrative combat unit of the Alda Army, responsible for military training, tactical research, standard setting, and many other tasks. Of course, other military units also conduct military training and tactical research, but the training regiment's functions in these areas are more professional, focused, and systematic. It not only trains new recruits but also officers, non-commissioned officers, and other personnel at all levels. Its research and training results serve as guidance and demonstrations for other units, hence the name Training Regiment. Shortly after Catherine and her group arrived, Paul encountered another unexpected person, Mariana. He had received a letter from Andrew saying that Mariana had appeared in Corner Bay and was closely related to Grand Duchess Helen of the Duchy of Eton. Paul wasn't surprised. He had already learned from Laddie about the teacher-student relationship between Mariana, Laddie, and Helen. Based on this, he deduced that Mariana, or perhaps the secret society, was behind Eton becoming the first country in the world to recognize the legitimate rights of spellcasters. After much hesitation, he wrote a letter to Corner Bay and asked Andrew to pass it on to his mother. In his letter, he mentioned his upcoming wedding, without explicitly stating whether he would invite Marianne back for the ceremony. However, the implications of his words were clear to the experienced Crimson Witch. Marianne felt a mix of emotions. Although Paul still harbored resentment towards her for leaving him in his childhood, it was better than him ignoring her completely. So, after the Battle of Cape Bay, She immediately set off north, returning to the place she considered home. Her other son, Nathan, seemed reluctant to come, but his mother forcibly dragged him to the Northwest Bay. "This is your brother's wedding," she said. "You can't be so cold." Marianne's arrival surprised Paul, or rather, delighted. Such an important moment in his life, he naturally wanted his closest relatives to witness it with him, even if he still felt some awkwardness towards his mother. After careful consideration, Paul revealed Marianne's identity to his fiancée, excluding the matter of the mystic order. Catherine was shocked. Paul's mother was still alive, and a witch. Good heavens. However, after the initial shock, she asked to meet Marianne. Paul arranged for them to meet, and to his delight, they chatted amiably, reminiscing about their childhoods in a very harmonious atmosphere. But then, for some reason, they started talking about orcs. Truly, women focused on their careers. The powerful orc army had penetrated deep into Alder, and even though the Arda army had won a battle, they had only defeated a small detachment of orcs. Seeing the concerns expressed by his mother and fiancé, Paul felt it necessary to encourage them. So, he took Catherine, Marianne, and his younger brother, who clearly intended to appear aloof but insisted on coming along, to a nearby ironworks for a visit. Unsurprisingly, all three were deeply awestruck. The imposing ironworks, shrouded in smoke, displayed the magnificent beauty of industry. The coke-fired iron-making process was widely used, towering chimneys spewed thick smoke, and massive water wheels roared, providing a continuous power source for the blast furnaces and forging hammers. In the blazing blast furnace, molten iron surged forth like lava, its golden red glow illuminating the dimly lit workshop, as if the earth's blood were boiling. The molten iron flowed slowly down the channels, radiating a scorching heat, the air thick with the intense aroma of metal and fire. Workers scooped up the boiling molten iron with long-handled ladles and poured it into molds, sparks flying like a meteor shower in the night sky. Beside the stirring furnace, people wielded iron bars, transforming pig iron into more resilient wrought iron. Molten iron splashed under the heavy blows, turning into specks of golden light. Inside the massive workshop, mechanical gears meshed and turned, forging hammers rose and fell with thunderous force, and iron blocks gradually took shape under the relentless impact. This was not merely a place for iron smelting, but a symbol of humanity's conquest of nature and mastery of technology, showcasing immense power and limitless possibilities. It represented not only a technological leap, but also the birth of a new era. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.